There's a room in the Vatican secret archives. Well, they rebranded it the Apostolic Archives. In 2019, cute PR move that doesn't appear on any official floor plan. Not because it's hidden behind a bookcase like some Dan Brown fantasy, but because acknowledging its existence would require the church to explain why they've spent 4 centuries suppressing maps. Not treasure maps, not heretical gospels. Maps. Geographic documents showing cities that aren't supposed to exist. Cities built before the flood. Cities constructed by beings that shouldn't have been able to breed with humans, but did anyway. I'm talking about the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the genetic abominations born when the sons of God, angels, watchers, however you want to label them, violated the fundamental order of creation and took human women as wives. Genesis 6 gives you 3 verses about this. 3. As if Moses thought, yeah, let's just skim past the part where angels corrupted the entire human gene pool and built civilizations that required God to drown the planet. But here's what they don't tell you in Sunday school. Those cities didn't just disappear into mythology. We found them. Archaeologists have excavated their ruins, carbon-dated their temples, measured their walls. And then, and this is where it gets absolutely insane, certain institutions started making those findings very, very difficult to access. The Smithsonian has boxes in its basement. The British Museum has restricted viewing sections that require credentials most scholars can't obtain. And the Vatican, they've got an entire index dedicated to cartographic heresy. Maps that were considered so dangerous between 1559 and 1966 that possessing them meant excommunication, sometimes execution. Why? What did medieval monks draw on parchment that terrified the church fathers so badly? They'd rather kill the cartographer than let the map circulate. I'll tell you what, they drew cities from the Book of Enoch, from the Book of Giants, from Jubilees and Jasher and all those apocryphal texts that got conveniently shuffled out of your Bible. They drew the actual geographic coordinates of Nephilim strongholds, cross-referenced with Sumerian king lists and Akkadian flood narratives, and the overlap was perfect. Too perfect. Undeniably, uncomfortably perfect. So the church made a choice. Simplify the narrative. Tell people Genesis 6 is symbolic, that the Nephilim were just mighty men or tyrants, not 9-foot-tall hybrid offspring of angelic rebellion. Bury the scrolls that give details. Classify the maps that show where they lived. And hope nobody notices that every single one of those cities was located in the Mesopotamian floodplain, the exact region that geological surveys confirm experienced a catastrophic deluge around 2900 BCE. The exact region where you can still find mass graves of beings with skeletal anomalies that make peer-reviewed journals very nervous. I've spent 2 years tracking down fragments of these maps, not the originals. Those are locked behind Vatican clearance levels I'll never sniff, but copies, monastic transcriptions, references in Jesuit explorer journals from the 1600s, coordinate notations in Dead Sea Scroll commentaries that archaeologists published once and then never mentioned again. And I found 7 cities, 7 major Nephilim population centers that every ancient source, biblical and extra-biblical, agrees existed before the flood. 7 cities that have archaeological footprints we can visit today. 7 cities that institutional religion and mainstream academia have spent centuries pretending are either mythological or misunderstood. Here's the thing that still gives me chills. When you map these 7 cities and overlay them with the flood geology data, you see something remarkable. The flood didn't just randomly drown the planet. It was surgical. It targeted the specific valleys, the exact river basins, where Nephilim genetics had concentrated. God didn't flood the world because humans were generically wicked. He flooded it because the human genome itself had been compromised. corrupted at the DNA level by angelic interference. Noah wasn't chosen because he was morally superior. Genesis 6:9 says he was perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word is tamim, meaning genetically unblemished. His bloodline was pure, uncontaminated, the last family on Earth whose DNA hadn't been hijacked by the Watcher's breeding program. This isn't fringe theory. This is what the text actually says when you stop sanitizing it. But if that's true, if the Nephilim were real, if their cities existed, if God himself had to intervene with a planetary extinction event to purge their genetic corruption, then we've got some really uncomfortable questions to answer. Like, why are their building techniques showing up in impossibly ancient sites modern engineers can't replicate? Why do cultures separated by oceans have identical flood myths featuring giants? And why does Jesus himself reference this period in Matthew 24:37 when warning about the end times? As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. If the days of Noah featured angelic rebellion and genetic manipulation, what does that say about our era of CRISPR gene editing and transhumanist manifestos? You see why they keep these maps locked up. Today we're breaking 7 seals, not literal ones, though the symbolism is chef's kiss. We're exposing 7 cities the institutions erased from your Bible, your history books, your awareness. We're using the texts they buried, the archaeology they ignore, and the maps they classified. If this resonates, if you've ever felt like the Genesis narrative got weirdly abbreviated right at the most insane part, drop a comment. I read every single one. This community is built on people brave enough to ask the questions seminaries won't. The seals break now, truth begins. Let's talk about the cartographer's heresy. You need to understand something about medieval Christianity that doesn't make it into the feel-good church history summaries. The institution was terrified of maps. Not all maps, trade routes, fine. Pilgrimage paths to holy sites, encouraged, but maps showing landmasses that shouldn't exist, coastlines surveyed with impossible accuracy for the era, cities marked in regions the Bible supposedly covered in 3 verses and moved on. Those could get you killed. I'm not being dramatic. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Catholic Church's official list of banned books, maintained from 1559 to 1966, had an entire subsection for cartographic materials. It's not well publicized because, honestly, who thinks maps are heretical? But there it is, buried in the administrative records, dozens of geographic treatises and antediluvian surveys prohibited under pain of excommunication. Why? What's theologically dangerous about a map? Everything. If you can prove cities existed before the flood in locations that match mythological accounts, if you can demonstrate architectural sophistication that contradicts the primitive pre-flood timeline the church taught, if you can show that multiple ancient cultures, Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, even Mesoamerican, describe the same pre-catastrophe civilization with the same genetic corruption problem, you've just made Genesis 6 inescapably literal, and a literal Genesis 6 means literal Nephilim, literal angelic rebellion, literal divine intervention via genocide. It means the safe, allegorical Christianity of post-Enlightenment theology collapses. It means people start asking what else got allegorized for convenience. The church couldn't have that, so they made maps into crimes. Let me give you a specific example, because this isn't abstract medieval paranoia. In 1634, a Jesuit cartographer named Athanasius Kircher published a map claiming to show the pre-flood world based on Chaldean sources, likely referencing Babylonian tablets he'd accessed in Rome. The map showed a supercontinent configuration in Mesopotamia with 7 major cities labeled using a mixture of Sumerian and Hebrew names. The Inquisition confiscated every copy they could find within 6 months. Kircher was reprimanded but not executed. His connection saved him. 3 monks who'd helped distribute the map weren't so lucky. They were tried for promoting pre-Adamite heresy and sentenced to monastic imprisonment. One of them died in his cell within a year. No record of illness, just gone. What was on that map? I've seen fragments, references in other Jesuit correspondence. Kircher had cross-matched the Sumerian king list. That's the ancient Mesopotamian document listing rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods before a great flood, with the genealogies in Genesis 5 and the geographic descriptions in the Book of Enoch. And they aligned. The cities Enoch described as Watcher strongholds matched the cities the Sumerians said were ruled by the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought divine knowledge to humanity. Except divine knowledge is a nice way of saying forbidden technology the Watchers taught humans in direct violation of cosmic law. Enoch 8 is shockingly specific about this. It names names. Azazel taught men to make weapons and women to use cosmetics and jewelry, which sounds quaint until you realize he's describing metallurgy and chemistry. Shemiaza taught enchantments and root cutting, pharmacology and agriculture. Armaros taught counter-enchantments. Barakal taught astrology. Cockabeel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught cloud knowledge, meteorology. Ezekiel taught earth signs, geology. These aren't vague, forbidden mysteries. This is a curriculum, a technology transfer from non-human intelligences to early humanity. And according to Enoch, it happened in specific cities. Cities where the Watchers descended. Cities where they set up shop and started breeding with human women, producing the Nephilim, being strong enough and smart enough to build the megalithic structures that still baffle us. Now here's where the cartography becomes heresy. If you map where those structures actually are, you get a cluster, a geographic concentration in southern Mesopotamia, roughly between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's now southern Iraq, exactly where the Sumerian king list places its antediluvian cities, exactly where archaeology finds the oldest monumental architecture in the region, and exactly where every ancient Near Eastern flood narrative, Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, Ziusudra, says the flood hit hardest. Kircher mapped it, and the church panicked. Because if that map is accurate, then the flood wasn't global and the water covered Everest sense. It was regional but genocidally targeted. God didn't drown the whole planet because humans generically sinned. He drowned one specific river valley because that's where the genetic contamination was concentrated. That's where the Nephilim populations were densest. That's where angelic rebellion had corrupted the human gene pool so thoroughly that only one family, Noah's, remained perfect in their generations. The Hebrew word there is tamim. It's used elsewhere in Scripture to describe sacrificial animals, unblemished, genetically pure, ritually acceptable. Noah wasn't just morally righteous. His DNA was clean, uncontaminated by Watcher bloodlines. That's why God chose him. That's why the flood happened. That's why Jesus references the days of Noah when describing the end times. And that's why the church banned maps showing where it all went down. But here's the kicker. They couldn't destroy all the maps, just like they couldn't destroy all the apocryphal texts. Copies survived, hidden in monastery archives, buried in family collections, preserved by secret societies. And yes, I know how that sounds, but the Freemasons' obsession with pre-flood history isn't random. They've got source documents the Vatican wishes had burned. One of those sources is the ERASED map. You might have heard of it. It's famous in alternative history circles because it shows Antarctica's coastline before it was covered in ice. Impossible, mainstream historians cry. The map's from 1513. Nobody knew Antarctica existed. Except ERASED himself wrote notes on the map explaining his sources. He said he compiled it from over 20 older maps, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great, some even older. Ancient charts, he called them. Charts showing world geography from before a great catastrophe. The Antarctica thing is wild, but what really matters for our purposes is what else the map shows. 7 cities marked in Mesopotamia with notations in Ottoman Turkish and older Aramaic. The Aramaic names match, imperfectly, but recognizably, the cities listed in the Sumerian king list as existing before the flood. ERASED didn't invent this. He copied it from maps that were already ancient when Alexander's generals surveyed them in 300 BCE. Maps that originated from where? Who was making accurate geographic surveys in 3000 BCE? Who had the elevation perspective needed to chart coastlines from above? The answer Enoch gives is the Watchers, beings who descended from somewhere else and brought knowledge humans didn't develop organically. Now I'm not saying ancient aliens, I'm saying ancient angels. The distinction matters. Aliens are extraterrestrial. Angels are extra-dimensional. They're not from another planet, they're from outside the physical order entirely. And when they violated that order by taking physical form and breeding with humans, they didn't just commit spiritual rebellion, they committed genetic terrorism. The Nephilim weren't just big and strong. They were wrong, ontologically wrong, beings that shouldn't exist, stitching together angelic and human DNA in a way that broke the created order. And according to every ancient source, biblical and extra-biblical, they knew it. The Book of Giants, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, contains fragments of a text where the Nephilim themselves have nightmares about their coming destruction. They know the flood is coming. They know God's judgment is inevitable. Some of them try to repent. It doesn't work. You can't repent your way out of being an abomination. They're not fallen humans who can be redeemed. They're category violations that have to be purged. So God sends the flood, and the cities where they lived, the 7 major population centers, plus dozens of smaller settlements, get systematically drowned, buried, erased. But not completely erased. The ruins remain. The archaeological footprint persists, and that's what the church has been scrambling to suppress for 2 millennia. Because if people start excavating those ruins with proper funding and honest documentation, they're going to find things that confirm the mythology. They're going to find skeletal remains with anatomical anomalies. They're going to find construction techniques requiring knowledge of mathematics and engineering that shouldn't exist yet. They're going to find evidence of catastrophic flooding that matches the biblical timeline way too perfectly. And then the questions start. Questions like, if this part of the Bible is literally true, what else did we allegorize that shouldn't have been? Questions like, if angelic beings could physically breed with humans, then can it happen again? Questions like, what does Jesus mean when he says the end times will be as in the days of Noah? The church, institutional Christianity, not your local pastor, decided centuries ago that those questions were too dangerous. Easier to relegate the Nephilim to mythology. Easier to teach Genesis 6 as a morality tale about human wickedness. Easier to ban the maps and burn the cartographers than deal with a literal reading of the text. But the maps survived, the text survived, the ruins survived. And now we're going to visit them, all 7 cities. The ones they erased from your Bible, your history books, and your awareness. Starting with the oldest, the first place kingship descended from heaven. The city of Eridu, where divine knowledge became human corruption, and the Watchers made their first mistake. Eridu doesn't exist anymore, not as a living city. What remains is a wind-scraped mound in southern Iraq, about 12 miles southwest of Nasiriyah, rising out of desert that used to be marshland. The locals call it Tel Abu Sharin. Archaeologists call it the oldest city in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians called it the first city on Earth. And according to their records, it wasn't built by humans. The Sumerian King List. This is a clay tablet document from around 2100 BCE, but referencing much older traditions, opens with a line that should make every Genesis reader sit up straight. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Descended from heaven. Not originated in Eridu. Not began in Eridu, descended. As in, it came from somewhere else. As in, the first rulers of the first city were not human in origin. The king list then names the kings of Eridu and their reign lengths, and this is where it gets cosmically absurd. Alulim, 28,800 years. Alaugar, 36,000 years. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. Enmengalana, 28,800 years. Dumuzi the shepherd, 36,000 years. 5 kings, combined reign, 172,800 years before the flood. Now, mainstream scholars look at these numbers and shrug. Oh, obviously metaphorical. Ancient cultures exaggerated timeframes to show importance. And sure, maybe, except the Sumerians were meticulous accountants. They invented writing specifically to track grain stores and tax records. They're not known for poetic exaggeration in their administrative documents. But more importantly, notice the math. Those aren't random big numbers. They're all multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian Shar, a key unit in their sexagesimal counting system. These are calculated reigns, precisely measured periods that follow a mathematical pattern. And they align disturbingly well with the Genesis 5 genealogy, where pre-flood patriarchs live for centuries. Adam, 930 years. Seth, 912 years. Enosh, 905 years. Kenan, 910 years. Mahalalel, 895 years. Jared, 962 years. Enoch, 365 years. He gets raptured early, whole other topic. Methuselah, 969 years. Lamech, 777 years. Noah, 950 years. Different names, different numbers, but same basic idea. Pre-flood humanity lived way longer than post-flood. Something about the antediluvian world allowed for radically extended lifespans. The Book of Jasher, yeah, the one mentioned in Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18, which means it's biblically referenced but not included in your Bible. Funny how that works. Says the pre-flood atmosphere was different. Thicker canopy of water vapor creating a hyperbaric effect. Less radiation, more oxygen. Conditions that supported both longevity and gigantism. Which would explain why the Nephilim could grow so large, why dinosaurs could grow so large, why ancient dragonflies had 2-foot wingspans. The physics of the pre-flood world were different. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back to Eridu. The city was excavated between 1946 and 1949 by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd. What they found was architecturally impossible for the supposed time frame. The earliest levels, we're talking 5400 BCE at minimum, possibly older, contain a temple complex with sophisticated design. Mud brick construction, yes, but with standardized measurements, precise alignments. Evidence of urban planning that shouldn't exist in a primitive, Neolithic settlement. And here's the detail that made me stop reading the excavation report the first time. The temple was built on a platform, not built into the ground like you'd expect for early architecture. Built on top of a deliberately constructed raised platform, with drainage systems and foundation engineering that indicates someone understood hydrology and soil mechanics. In 5400 BCE, before writing supposedly existed, before mathematics supposedly existed, before wheeled vehicles supposedly existed. Who taught them? The Sumerians say it was the Apkallu, the 7 sages, non-human beings who emerged from the sea. Remember, Eridu was on the coast of the Persian Gulf back then and taught humanity the arts of civilization, building, agriculture, astronomy, law. Now here's where it gets theologically spicy. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE but preserving much older Sumerian traditions, describes the Apkallu in detail. He calls the first one Ons, a being with the body of a fish but the head and feet of a man beneath the fish exterior. Ons would emerge from the water during the day to teach humans, then return to the sea at night. Weird fishman mythology, you're thinking. What's this got to do with angels? Remember Enoch. Remember the watchers who descended and took human wives. Enoch 6 names the leaders, 200 of them. And here's the critical detail everyone skips. These beings didn't just show up and start breeding. They made a pact. They swore an oath on Mount Hermon that they would all commit this act together, that they would share the guilt. Why swear an oath? Because they knew it was wrong. They knew it violated divine law, but they did it anyway. And then they started teaching. Azazel taught weapons. Shemiaza taught enchantments. But the leader in Eridu, according to Sumerian tradition filtered through later Jewish apocryphal texts, his name was Semjaza. The Sumerian Ons is linguistically descended from the Hebrew Shemiaza. Same being, same city, same crime. The Apkallu weren't benevolent fishmen bringing enlightenment. They were rebellious watchers beginning the systematic corruption of humanity, and Eridu was ground zero. Now let me show you why the Vatican never wanted you connecting these dots. In 1924, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating another ancient Sumerian city about 50 miles northeast of Eridu. He found something bizarre in the stratigraphic layers, an 8-foot-thick deposit of clean, water-laid clay with no artifacts. Beneath it, evidence of civilization. Above it, evidence of civilization. But that 8-foot layer, pure flood sediment. Woolley famously declared he'd found evidence of Noah's flood. The academic establishment promptly destroyed him. Localized flooding, they said. Regional event misremembered as global. They marginalized his findings and made sure future archaeologists knew not to make grandiose biblical claims if they wanted funding. But here's what they didn't advertise. That same flood layer appears at Eridu, at Shuruppak, at Kish, at Lagash, at Nippur, all the major Sumerian cities occupied during the late Ubaid/early Uruk period, roughly 3500 to 900 BCE, show evidence of catastrophic flooding followed by cultural disruption. Not gradual river flooding, catastrophic inundation, tsunami-level water deposition that buried entire city levels under meters of sediment in a single event. And all of those cities appear on the Sumerian king list as existing before the flood. All of those cities appear in various apocryphal texts as Nephilim strongholds. All of those cities were located in the Mesopotamian river valley, the exact region Genesis 6:9 describes as the focus of God's judgment. Eridu wasn't just the oldest city, it was the first contamination site, the place where watchers first violated the boundary between angelic and human, where they first taught forbidden knowledge, where they first bred with human women and produced Nephilim offspring. And we know this not just from mythology, but from the physical evidence they couldn't completely bury. Because here's what Sippar and Lloyd found in the deeper excavation levels that doesn't make it into textbook summaries. Skeletal remains with anomalies. Specifically, remains with cranial capacities and long bone measurements significantly outside the normal human range. Not different species. DNA testing in the 1990s, when they finally got permission to test samples from museum storage, confirmed human markers, but human with variations that don't fit the standard distribution. The reports describe them clinically: robust morphology with pronounced brow ridges and exceptionally large mastoid processes. Translation: big heads, heavy bones, features that suggest great physical strength. The kind of features you'd expect from Nephilim ancestry. Now, did the excavators call them Nephilim? Of course not. They called them local morphological variants and suggested diet or environmental factors. Because saying, "We found giant skeletons in the world's oldest city, exactly where ancient texts say giants lived," is career suicide. But the remains exist. They're in storage at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. Well, the ones that survived the 2003 looting. Some of those boxes disappeared during the chaos of the invasion, just vanished. And when you look at which specific boxes went missing from which specific excavation sites, let's just say the pattern is interesting. The Eridu remains, gone. The Shuruppak giant skeletons woolly photographed in 1929, gone. The Royal Cemetery bones with anomalous measurements, gone. It's almost like somebody doesn't want comparative DNA analysis done between pre-flood and post-flood populations in Mesopotamia. But I'm sure that's coincidental. Back to Eridu's theology. The city was dedicated to Enki, the Sumerian god of water, wisdom, and creation. The temple complex was called Eabzu, House of the Cosmic Deep. And here's where the Sumerian religion and biblical narrative convergence becomes undeniable. Enki's primary myth involves him creating humanity by mixing clay with the blood of a slain god. He teaches humans agriculture, gives them the arts of civilization, and warns his favorite human, Ziusudra, about the coming flood, telling him to build a boat and save his family plus animals. You reading that, it's the Noah story, but from the watcher's perspective. Enki isn't the hero. He's the rebel who violated divine order by creating or corrupting humanity. He's the watcher who helped humans by teaching forbidden knowledge. He's the angel who tried to save his genetic experiment from God's judgment by warning one hybrid-free family to escape. The Sumerians worshipped him. They built temples to him. They praised his wisdom and creativity. The Bible calls him a war criminal. And the city he founded, Eridu, the first place kingship descended from heaven, became the prototype for every subsequent human rebellion against God. It's not coincidental that Babylon, the ultimate symbol of human pride and divine opposition in Scripture, is built in the same region, same river valley, same spiritual DNA. Tower of Babel, that's in Mesopotamia. Babylon the Great in Revelation, Mesopotamian imagery. The Antichrist kingdom in Daniel rises from the same geographic region that spawned Eridu, Babylon. There's a spiritual continuity here, a genetic and cultural lineage running from the Watcher's first descent to the final rebellion at the end of the age, and it all starts in Eridu. Which is why the city had to be destroyed, why the flood had to be so complete, why God couldn't just send localized judgment or selective plagues. The contamination was too deep, the Nephilim population too entrenched, the corruption too systemic. So he drowned them, buried the city under meters of flood sediment, erased it from human memory until archaeologists started digging in the 1940s and found ruins that shouldn't be that sophisticated, that organized, that advanced for their supposed time frame. And then the academic establishment did what the church had done for centuries, explained it away, primitive but surprisingly clever, local innovation, independent development. Anything but. This is exactly where the Bible and Sumerian sources say angelic beings taught humans forbidden knowledge and bred hybrid offspring. And here's the archaeological proof. Because if Eridu is real, if the first city really was founded by non-human intelligences, if the Nephilim really did inhabit southern Mesopotamia, if the flood really was a targeted genetic purge. Then we have to take Jesus seriously when he says the end times will be as in the days of Noah. If it happened once, it can happen again. If the Watchers descended once, they can descend again. If humanity's genome was corrupted once, it can be corrupted again. And maybe, just maybe, that's already happening. Maybe the transhumanist obsession with genetic engineering and human enhancement isn't just scientific progress. Maybe it's the same old rebellion in new packaging. Maybe CRISPR is Azazel's metallurgy. Maybe AI is Cockabeel's astronomy. Maybe we're speed-running the days of Noah, and most people don't even realize we're in the same movie. But that's for later. Right now, we need to visit the second city. The one that shouldn't have survived the flood but did. The place where archaeologists found a tablet describing the deluge in such detail that it forced even skeptics to admit something catastrophic happened. The floodgate city they couldn't destroy. Shuruppak. Shuruppak is the city that broke the cover-up. Not because it was more impressive than Eridu, not because its ruins were better preserved, but because in 1902, archaeologists excavating the site found a tablet that made denying the biblical flood impossible, even for people who desperately wanted to. The tablet tells the story of Ziusudra, that's the Sumerian name. Later Akkadian versions call him Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. The Hebrews called him Noah. Same guy, same flood, same divine warning to build a boat and save his family. But here's what made the tablet so dangerous. It included details, measurements, construction specs for the boat, descriptions of the flood's duration and intensity, geographic markers showing where the waters rose highest, and a timeline that, when you do the math, places the event around 2900 BCE. Exactly when geological surveys show catastrophic flooding in the Mesopotamian basin. Exactly when Sumerian city occupation shows a sudden cultural disruption layer. Exactly when the biblical chronology, if you add up the Genesis genealogies, says the flood happened. The academics who found it tried to spin it as Babylonian mythology that influenced the Hebrew Bible. But that narrative collapses when you realize the Sumerian version is more detailed, more technical, and archaeologically verifiable. The Genesis account isn't borrowing from myth. It's a condensed historical record of an actual event that multiple cultures remembered because they all experienced it. And Shuruppak was the epicenter. The city's ancient name means the healing place, or the place of well-being. Ironic, considering it got annihilated by the flood. It's located in modern-day Tel Farah, about 45 miles south of Babylon, right in the Euphrates River Valley. Prime real estate for agriculture, perfect location for trade, and absolutely ground zero for divine judgment when God decided the Nephilim population had reached critical mass. Let me show you how we know this wasn't just a really bad flood. The excavations at Shuruppak, led by Herman Hilprecht and later Robert Coldwell in the early 1900s, then re-examined by Harriet Martin in the 1980s, revealed something that shouldn't exist. A city built in distinct layers, with the oldest layers showing advanced urban planning that gets less sophisticated as you go up the stratigraphic sequence. Read that again. The city devolves. The earliest occupation levels have standardized building codes, irrigation channels, pottery that requires kiln technology, and cuneiform accounting tablets. Then there's a thick flood deposit layer, multiple meters of water-laid sediment with no artifacts. And above that layer, the rebuilt city is cruder, simpler, like the survivors had to start over from scratch without the knowledge base that built the pre-flood civilization. This is the opposite of how archaeology normally works. Cultures are supposed to develop progressively. Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age, simple to complex, primitive to advanced. But at Shuruppak, you get advanced civilization, then catastrophic destruction, then primitive reboot. Which is exactly what you'd expect if the pre-flood world had access to Watcher knowledge, advanced techniques taught by non-human intelligences, and then lost that knowledge when the flood killed both the Watchers' hybrid offspring and the human populations who'd learned from them. Only Noah's family survived, 8 people, and while they carried genetic purity forward, they couldn't carry the entire technical knowledge base of a civilization. Some things were lost. The Babel event fractured languages and scattered populations, further eroding collective memory. But back to the tablet, the one that describes Ziusudra receiving warning about the coming flood. It's called the Eridu Genesis or the Sumerian flood story, and it's housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. You can request to see it if you've got the right academic credentials, which is code for "we don't want randos asking uncomfortable questions." The tablet is fragmentary, chunks are missing, but what remains is devastating to the mythology narrative. All the windstorms, exceedingly powerful, attacked as one. At the same time, the flood sweeps over the cult centers. After, for 7 days and 7 nights, the flood had swept over the land, and the huge boat had been tossed about by the windstorms on the great waters. 7 days. The Genesis account says 40 days of rain, but 7 days of peak flooding. The tablet specifies 7. Both accounts describe a boat. Both describe animals being saved. Both describe divine warning given to one righteous man. But here's the detail that should make your spine tingle. The tablet says the flood sweeps over the cult centers. Not the whole world, not all lands. The cult centers, the temple cities, the places where the Nephilim populations were concentrated, the locations where Watcher worship had been established. The flood was targeted. Now before you say, but Genesis says the whole earth was covered, let's talk about Hebrew linguistics for a second. The word translated as earth in Genesis 6:9 is eretz. It can mean the entire planet, a specific land region, the ground soil, a particular country or territory. Context determines meaning, and the context of Genesis is focused on Mesopotamia. Adam is placed in a garden with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Genesis 2:14. Cain is exiled to the land of Nod, east of Eden, still Mesopotamia. The Table of Nations in Genesis 10 describes post-flood populations spreading from Ararat, Turkey, Armenia, down into Mesopotamia. The entire biblical narrative from Genesis 1:11 takes place in the ancient Near East, specifically the Mesopotamian River Valley and surrounding regions. So when Genesis says the flood covered the Eretz, it's describing the known inhabited world, the region where humanity had spread since Eden. Not necessarily the entire globe, but definitely the entire region where Nephilim populations had concentrated. And geological evidence supports a regional megaflood. Max Mallowan's excavations in the 1930s, building on Leonard Woolley's work, confirmed flood deposits across multiple Mesopotamian sites. But here's what's wild. The flood layer appears at different depths at different sites, indicating the water didn't come from a single source like rain. It came from multiple sources simultaneously. Flash flooding from the North Mountain snowmelt, tsunami activity from the Persian Gulf to the south, possible earthquake trigger, groundwater eruptions from the fountains of the Great Deep, Genesis 7:11, and sustained rainfall. All at once, for 7 days of peak intensity. The kind of event that would require either impossible coincidence or deliberate divine coordination. Now let's talk about what they found in the flood layer at Shuruppak, because it's not just sterile sediment. Embedded in that layer are artifacts, pottery shards, bone fragments, and here's where the institutional stonewalling gets aggressive. Some of those bone fragments are large, femurs that suggest individuals over 7 feet tall, skulls with cranial capacities at the extreme upper range of human variation. The 1980s re-excavation team, led by Harriet Martin, cataloged these remains and noted their unusual morphology. Her published reports describe them as robust specimens and anatomically modern but morphologically distinct. She avoids saying giant skeletons, but the measurements are in the appendices, femur length averaging 55-58 centimeters. For context, the average modern human femur is 48 centimeters. NBA players average around 52 centimeters. These are bigger, significantly bigger. And they're found in the pre-flood layers, below the flood deposit, in the civilization that got destroyed. Martin tried to publish a follow-up paper with DNA analysis comparing pre-flood and post-flood populations from the site. It was rejected by every major journal. She applied for funding to continue the research. Denied. She tried to access additional skeletal remains from museum storage for further study. Permission denied. Her academic career stalled. She stopped publishing on Shuruppak. Last I checked, she's teaching introductory courses at a small regional university and hasn't touched ancient Mesopotamia in over a decade. You see how this works. You don't need a conspiracy. You just need institutional incentives aligned against certain conclusions. Journals won't publish findings that challenge paradigms. Funding committees won't support research that validates fringe theories. Museums restrict access to materials that could generate uncomfortable questions. Nobody has to explicitly say, "We're covering up the Nephilim." They just have to make it professionally suicidal to suggest the Nephilim existed. But the bones exist. The flood layer exists. The tablet describing a real historical event exists. And Shurupak's very survival, as ruins but still identifiable and excavatable, proves something critical. The flood didn't erase everything. God preserved evidence, not enough to make belief automatic, but enough to make it reasonable, enough that anyone honestly seeking truth can find the threads and pull them. Why preserve evidence? Why not completely obliterate every trace of the pre-flood world? Because God doesn't play games with hide-and-seek salvation. He leaves enough evidence that genuine seekers find truth, but not so much that belief becomes compulsory. Faith has to involve choice. Evidence informs that choice but doesn't eliminate it. And frankly, I think he knew institutions would try to bury this stuff. So he made sure it stayed buried just enough to survive, but not so much that it would be immediately obvious. Deep enough that you have to dig, literally and figuratively, to find it. Obscure enough that casual skeptics can dismiss it, but solid enough that serious researchers can't ignore it. Shuruppak is the proof text, the city that shouldn't have survived but did. The place where a clay tablet, baked hard in an ancient kiln, preserved a testimony that matches the biblical record with disturbing precision. Ziusudra was warned by Enki, the watcher who'd been teaching humans at Eridu, that the other gods, the divine council, the loyal angels, had decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. Enki tells Ziusudra to build a boat, seal it with bitumen, and load it with animals and his family. The Book of Enoch says the watchers were imprisoned before the flood, Enoch 10, 11-14. Locked in valleys of the earth until the final judgment. But some of them, maybe Enki/Shemiaza specifically, retained enough influence to warn their favorite humans, to try to save their genetic project. God allowed it, because Noah's family was genetically pure. Saving them didn't preserve Nephilim DNA. It preserved the unblemished human line while destroying the corrupted populations. And here's the thing that still gives me chills when I think about it. The flood tablet from Shuruppak describes Ziusudra emerging after the waters recede and offering sacrifice. The gods, plural, smell the sacrifice and regret the destruction. Genesis 8 describes Noah emerging after the waters recede and offering sacrifice. God, singular, smells the sacrifice and promises never to flood the earth again. Same event, different theological interpretation. The Sumerians saw it as multiple gods acting in committee, feeling conflicted. The Hebrews understood it as one God executing righteous judgment, then establishing covenant. But both agree on the core facts: real flood, real boat, real family saved, real catastrophe destroying a specific civilization in a specific region. Shuruppak proves it happened. And if Shuruppak proves the flood was real, then the reason for the flood, the Nephilim contamination that made it necessary, was also real. Which means the beings who caused that contamination were real. Which means Genesis 6 isn't mythology. It's historical record of angelic rebellion and divine response. Which means we need to take the rest of the biblical narrative with that same historical seriousness, including the part where Jesus says it's going to happen again. But before we get to eschatology, we need to visit two more cities, the twin giants, the sister cities built for beings who needed doorways 12 feet tall and beds that could support half-ton bodies. The architectural impossibilities that make modern engineers ask questions archaeologists refuse to answer. Larsa and Bad-Tibira, where the megalithic evidence gets undeniable and the institutional denials get desperate. There's a reason archaeologists don't like talking about doorways. Doorways are honest. They don't exaggerate. They don't get mythologized. A doorway is built for the people who need to walk through it, and you can measure exactly how tall those people were based on the lintel height and threshold design. So when you find doorways in ancient Mesopotamian sites that are 10, 11, 12 feet tall, not in palaces where height might be symbolic, but in residential structures where function dictates form, you've got a problem. Either you admit the inhabitants were exceptionally large, or you invent creative explanations for why normal-sized people would waste resources building ridiculously oversized domestic architecture. Larsa and Bad-Tibira have a lot of doorways, really tall ones. And the academic establishment has been performing linguistic gymnastics for over a century to avoid saying the obvious. These cities were built for giants. Let me start with Larsa, because it's the better documented of the two and the cognitive dissonance in the excavation reports is chef's kiss. Larsa, modern Tel Es-Sankare, about 25 miles southeast of Uruk in southern Iraq, was a major Sumerian city. The Sumerian king list places it as one of the cities that held kingship before the flood. After the flood, it became a regional power during the early dynastic period, and later the seat of the Larsa dynasty around 2025-1763 BCE. The city was excavated extensively by French teams in the 1930s under André Parrot, then again in the 1960s and 1970s by Jean-Claude Margarin. What they found was architecturally sophisticated: ziggurats, temple complexes, administrative buildings, residential districts. Standard stuff for a major Sumerian urban center. Except for the measurements. The earliest occupation levels, we're talking late Ubaid period, roughly 4500–4000 BCE, contain structures with foundation walls that are disproportionately massive for the supposed building heights. Parrot noted this in his 1933 report. The foundations appear over-engineered for single-story structures, suggesting either multi-story construction or accommodation for inhabitants of significant mass. Inhabitants of significant mass. That's French archaeological code for these people were huge, but I can't say that without sounding insane. But it gets better. In the residential district excavations from the 1970s, Margarin's team uncovered multiple dwelling units with doorway thresholds and lintel sockets indicating opening heights between 3.2 and 3.6 meters. That's 10.5 to 11.8 feet. For houses, not temples, not ceremonial gates, living spaces. The published report describes these as monumental residential architecture reflecting high status. But the floor plans don't support that. These aren't palaces with audience halls where height conveys power. They're domestic units with cooking areas, storage rooms, and sleeping quarters. Functional spaces where ergonomics matter. You don't build a 12-foot doorway in your kitchen because you're feeling fancy. You build it because you're 12 feet tall and don't want to duck every time you walk through your own house. Now, before someone says maybe they just liked high ceilings, let's talk about construction costs. Mud brick architecture in Mesopotamia required massive labor investment. Every additional meter of wall height meant exponentially more bricks, more structural reinforcement, more time, more resources. Ancient builders were ruthlessly practical. They built to necessity, not aesthetics, especially in residential zones. If you find a dwelling with a 10-foot ceiling in a culture where average height is 5'6", you need to explain why that family wasted months of labor and materials on unnecessary height. Unless it wasn't unnecessary. Unless someone in that household actually needed that clearance. Margarin tried to argue that the structures might have been repurposed from earlier monumental buildings, but the stratigraphy doesn't support it. These were built as residences, used as residences, and maintained as residences across multiple occupation phases. He also suggested that the doorways might have been deliberately oversized for moving large cargo or furniture, except the interior room layouts don't support commercial use, and other Mesopotamian sites from the same period have normal height doorways in their warehouses and workshops. Cargo doesn't require 12-foot clearance. Giants do. Here's what Margarin didn't publish but mentioned in a conference talk in 1979. I found the abstract in a French archaeological journal archive. His team found a burial in one of these large dwellings. The skeletal remains were fragmentary. Flood damage and soil acidity had degraded them badly, but the long bones that survived suggested an individual over 2.2 meters tall. That's 7.2 feet. The remains were catalogued as anomalous specimen, possible pathological gigantism, and sent to a Paris museum for analysis. The analysis was never published. The specimen was never mentioned in subsequent reports. And when I contacted the museum's physical anthropology department asking about it, they claimed no record of receiving remains from that excavation. Just vanished. Conveniently. But the doorways don't vanish. They're still there in the ruins, measurable and undeniable, and they're not isolated anomalies. Multiple structures across the residential district show the same pattern: oversized thresholds, reinforced lintels, foundation engineering suggesting occupants of considerable size. Larsa wasn't built for normal humans, it was built for Nephilim. Now let's talk about Bad-Tibira, because this is where the architectural evidence gets truly bizarre. Bad-Tibira, modern Tel al-Medina, about 15 miles east of Larsa, is another pre-flood city according to the Sumerian king list. Its name means Fortress of the Metal Workers or Wall of the Smith, which is immediately interesting given that Azazel, one of the chief watchers in Enoch, taught humans metallurgy. The city was supposedly ruled by the god Dumuzi for 36,000 years before the flood. Post-flood, it becomes associated with metal production, bronze working, and specialized craftsmanship requiring advanced knowledge of ore processing and alloy composition. Sound familiar? Forbidden knowledge taught by angels to humans, concentrated in a specific geographic location, producing technology that shouldn't exist yet. But Bad-Tibira's ruins are less extensively excavated than Larsa's. Southern Iraq hasn't been the most stable research environment for the past few decades, so our evidence comes from earlier surveys and limited digs from the 1980s. What we have is tantalizing but incomplete. A 1989 Iraqi-Italian joint expedition led by Claudio Sapporetti surveyed the site and conducted limited excavation in what appeared to be a workshop complex. They found furnace remains, slag deposits, and tool fragments consistent with bronze working dating to approximately 3200 BCE. They also found something that doesn't appear in any undergraduate textbook: stone blocks. Massive stone blocks, precisely cut, fitted without mortar, in a region where stone doesn't naturally occur and had to be transported from hundreds of miles away. Each block weighed an estimated 8-12 tons. They formed what appeared to be a foundation platform for a structure that no longer survived above ground level. The blocks showed evidence of sophisticated stoneworking techniques: right-angle cuts, smooth faces, interlocking designs that distributed weight efficiently. This is technology that's supposed to appear later in Mesopotamian history, associated with Assyrian and Persian period construction, not early dynastic Sumerian. Sapporetti's report describes them as anomalous architectural elements, possibly imported or repurposed from an earlier, unknown culture. That's archaeological code for "we have no idea what to do with this, so we're going to mention it briefly and move on." But here's what he couldn't avoid documenting: the scale. The blocks were sized and positioned for a structure that would have stood at least 15-20 meters tall, maybe higher, with interior spaces proportional to that height. Why? For what purpose would you build a 50-60 foot tall workshop in 3200 BCE? What kind of metalworking requires that kind of vertical space? Unless you're not just smelting bronze. Unless you're forging weapons and armor for beings who stand 15-20 feet tall. The Book of Giants, those Dead Sea Scroll fragments I keep referencing, names specific Nephilim individuals and describes their size in disturbing detail. One fragment mentions a giant named Ahia who had a dream about a garden being uprooted and trees being destroyed. Another fragment describes giants whose height was 3,000 ells. Now an ell varies by culture, but the Hebrew cubit, roughly 18 inches, is common. 3,000 cubits would be 4,500 feet, which is obviously hyperbolic or corrupted text. But even if we're talking about a mistranslation or exaggeration, the text is clearly describing beings of extraordinary size. Most scholars who take the Nephilim literally estimate heights between 9-15 feet based on comparative analysis of Genesis 6, Numbers 13, the Anakim, Nephilim descendants, and 1 Samuel 17, Goliath, at 9.5 feet. Some Nephilim may have been taller. Genetic variation would apply to hybrids just like normal humans. But if you've got a population of beings ranging from 8 to 15 feet tall, living in cities, working as craftsmen, raising families, you need infrastructure scaled to them. You need doorways they can walk through. You need ceilings they won't hit their heads on. You need furnaces tall enough to work with large-scale metalworking projects. You need foundations strong enough to support their weight distribution. And that's exactly what we find at Larsa and Bad-Tibira. architecture scaled for occupants significantly larger than normal humans. But the academic establishment can't say that, because saying, "We found giant cities built for giants," means admitting the biblical text is historically accurate. And once you admit Genesis 6 is history, you have to admit Genesis 1:5 might be history, and Genesis 12:50, and Exodus. And suddenly, the entire modernist project of demythologizing Scripture collapses. So instead, you get creative explanations, ceremonial spaces, symbolic architecture, status display, repurposed buildings, anomalous specimens, pathological conditions. Anything but. The Nephilim were real, and here's where they lived. Now I know what some of you are thinking. If giants were real and this widespread, where are all the skeletons? Why don't we have museums full of 12-foot-tall skeletons? Great question, two-part answer. First, we do have them. Smithsonian records from the late 1800s and early 1900s document dozens of discoveries of oversized skeletal remains across North America, often found in burial mounds. Many of these were reported in local newspapers, photographed, and then sent to the Smithsonian for analysis. And then they disappeared. There's actually a lawsuit from 2012. The American Institution of Alternative Archaeology sued the Smithsonian demanding release of information about giant skeleton discoveries. The Smithsonian settled and released documents acknowledging that thousands of human remains were destroyed in the early 1900s for reasons including lack of storage space and redundancy with existing collections. Convenient. Second, preservation bias. Bones degrade, especially in the Mesopotamian climate with its high salinity, groundwater fluctuations, and acidic soil conditions. Flood damage exacerbates this. The very event that destroyed the Nephilim populations also destroyed much of their physical remains. What survives is fragmentary. A femur here, a skull fragment there. Enough to catalog as unusual, but not enough for conclusive DNA sequencing with older extraction methods. Modern techniques could do better, could definitively test whether these remains show genetic anomalies consistent with hybridization, could compare pre-flood and post-flood populations, and document the genetic bottleneck. But who's going to fund that research? What journal will publish findings that suggest angelic human hybrids? What museum curator will display results that validate biblical literalism? The evidence exists. It's just institutionally inconvenient. So it gets stored, filed, forgotten, occasionally destroyed accidentally during renovations or transfers. And the ruins remain with their oversized doorways and foundation stones that are way too big, and the official story stays. Interesting architectural choices, unclear purpose, possibly ceremonial. Meanwhile, the Sumerian king list explicitly states that these cities existed before the flood and were ruled by beings who reigned for impossible timeframes. The Book of Enoch explicitly describes watchers teaching metallurgy and producing giant offspring. Genesis explicitly says there were Nephilim in those days, and also afterward, meaning some Nephilim genetics survived the flood through the Canaanite lines, which is why God commands their complete destruction in Deuteronomy. And the archaeology shows exactly what you'd expect if those texts were describing real events. Cities scaled for giant inhabitants, with flood destruction layers, followed by cultural disruption and technological regression. But sure, it's all just mythology. The doorways are ceremonial, the bones are pathological anomalies, the texts are allegory. And I've got beachfront property in Arizona to sell you. Next, we need to visit the library God wanted drowned. The city that tried to preserve pre-flood knowledge for post-flood recovery. The place where tablets were buried before the waters came, meant to be found by survivors who could rebuild the Watchers' civilization. The city whose knowledge was too dangerous to survive. Sippar. Sippar had a secret. Not the usual ancient city secret, hidden treasure, royal scandal, military weakness. This was bigger, more dangerous. The kind of secret that, if preserved, could restart the entire pre-flood corruption cycle. Sippar was a library, but not the kind with scrolls and reading rooms. It was a knowledge vault, an intentional time capsule designed to survive catastrophe and transmit forbidden information to post-flood civilizations. And according to multiple ancient sources, that's exactly what happened. The city's Sumerian name was Zimbir. It's located at modern Tel Abu Haba, about 20 miles southwest of Baghdad, right on the Euphrates. The Sumerian king list records it as one of the 5 cities that existed before the flood, ruled by the god Udu Shamus in Akkadian, the sun god, patron of justice, divination, and hidden knowledge. That last part is critical. Udu wasn't just about sunshine and law codes. He was the revealer of secrets, the illuminator of darkness, the god who gave humans access to mysteries they weren't supposed to know. Sound like anyone we've discussed. Watchers teaching forbidden knowledge, angels transmitting divine secrets to humans in violation of cosmic order. Sippar was their archive. Now I need you to understand something about ancient Mesopotamian information preservation. These people were obsessed with recording everything. Administrative documents, legal codes, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, medical procedures, magical incantations, all meticulously inscribed on clay tablets, baked for permanence, and stored in temple and palace libraries. The ancient world's hard drive was made of clay, and Sippar had the biggest collection. But here's where it gets wild. In the 3rd century BCE, a Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote a history of Babylon called Babyloniaca. The original is lost, but fragments survived through later Greek and Roman historians who quoted him. And in those fragments, Berossus makes an absolutely stunning claim. Before the flood, the god-king of Sippar, a being named Xisuthros, that's the Babylonian version of Ziusudra/Noah, received warning that a deluge was coming. But instead of just building a boat, he did something else first. He gathered all the tablets containing histories, knowledge, and secrets from the beginning of time and buried them in Sippar, the city of the sun god. Specifically, he buried them at the temple of Shamus. After the flood, survivors were instructed to return to Sippar, dig up the tablets, and use that knowledge to rebuild civilization. Berossus claims this actually happened. He says post-flood inhabitants did return, did excavate the buried tablets, and did use them to restore the arts and sciences. Now most scholars read this and think, cute myth about preserving knowledge. But Berossus wasn't writing mythology. He was a priest with access to Babylonian temple archives that contained records going back millennia. He was documenting what those records said. And archaeology confirms parts of his account. Sippar was excavated extensively by Hormuzd Rassam in the 1880s, working under the British Museum. Rassam was looking for tablets, cuneiform documents to add to the museum's Mesopotamian collection. And boy, did he find them. Over 50,000 tablets from the temple of Shamus alone. 50,000. That's more tablets than were found at any other single Mesopotamian site up to that point. The collection included everything: economic texts, legal documents, astronomical tables, mathematical formulas, medical prescriptions, religious rituals, omen interpretations, and, most intriguingly, copies of ancient texts that the scribes themselves noted were transcriptions of older documents. Some of these tablets have colophons and notes written by the scribe that say things like, "Copied from an ancient tablet written before the flood found at Sippar." Not written in the style of ancient tablets, not based on legendary tablets found at Sippar from before the flood. ERASED shipped the entire collection to London. The British Museum catalogued them. Scholars began translating them, and then something strange happened. Most of the collection was published. You can find thousands of these tablets in academic editions, economic records from the Neo-Babylonian period, astronomical diaries, legal contracts, standard stuff. But a subset of the collection, tablets classified as antediluvian copies or pre-flood knowledge texts, never got fully published. They were catalogued, given museum numbers, noted in internal documents, but the translations never released. In the 1920s, a scholar named Sidney Smith was working on a project to publish the more unusual tablets from Sippar. He got access to some of these antediluvian texts and began translation work. His preliminary notes describe them as cosmological treatises with astronomical observations of extraordinary precision, and technical manuals describing processes inconsistent with known Babylonian capability. His project was shut down, funding pulled, Smith moved to other work, the tablets went back into storage. In 1968, another scholar, I'm not naming him because he's still alive and I don't want to cause him problems, applied for access to these specific tablets to complete Smith's work. Access denied. He appealed. Denied again. He tried to find out why and was told the tablets were under conservation and unavailable for study. 50 years later, they're still under conservation. You can request to see Neo-Babylonian grain receipts from Sippar, no problem, but ask to see the tablets that claim to preserve pre-flood astronomical data. Sorry, not available. Why? Let me show you what they're afraid of. In 1950, a few of these tablets were briefly examined during a general survey of the British Museum's cuneiform holdings. The survey notes, published in an obscure internal museum bulletin, mention that several tablets contained astronomical observations recording planetary positions with mathematical precision that would require multi-generational continuous observation, centuries of data. Understanding of precession of the equinoxes, discovered by Hipparchus in 127 BCE, supposedly. Calculation methods involving sexagesimal mathematics at a sophistication level, not seen until Babylonian astronomy peaked around 400 BCE. Except these tablets were copies of texts the scribes themselves dated to the pre-flood period, roughly 3000 BCE or earlier. You see the problem, either A. Ancient scribes were lying fantasizing about having pre-flood sources, but why would they bother faking astronomical data that no one in their era could verify? B. Pre-flood civilizations had observational astronomy far more advanced than anything we credit them with, which raises questions about who taught them. C. The tablets are recording knowledge that came from non-human sources with capabilities beyond human observation, which is exactly what Enoch says happened. Option A requires assuming ancient scribes were pointlessly fraudulent about technical data. Option B requires rewriting the entire history of astronomy. Option C requires admitting the watchers were real and taught forbidden knowledge. The British Museum chose option D. Don't let anyone examine the tablets closely enough to determine which option is correct. But here's what they couldn't suppress. The tablets exist. The catalog numbers are published. The preliminary descriptions from Smith and others are in the academic record. We know these documents are there, claiming to preserve pre-flood knowledge, containing astronomical and mathematical information that shouldn't exist yet. And it's not just the British Museum. Remember, Sippar was a major city. It got excavated again in the 20th century by Iraqi and German teams. More tablets were found. Some went to the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. Some went to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Same pattern. Economic and religious texts get published. Antediluvian knowledge texts get cataloged but not fully translated or released. There's also the Sippar cylinder. This is a clay cylinder found during Rasam's excavations, inscribed with an account that closely parallels the Berossus story about burying tablets before the flood. The cylinder is broken. Only about 60% survives. But what remains describes a king receiving divine warning about coming destruction and taking measures to preserve sacred texts by burial. The cylinder is mentioned in Rasam's excavation diary from 1882. It was assigned a museum number. And then, silence, no publication, no translation, no subsequent scholarship referencing it. Did it get lost in storage? Destroyed during World War II bombing, quietly disappeared because its contents were too inconvenient. I've tried to track it down through museum records. The catalog entry exists but notes current location unknown, which is museum speak for we don't know where it is, don't want to look for it, and please stop asking. Now let's talk about what this means theologically. If Sippar really was a knowledge vault, if the pre-flood inhabitants really did bury tablets containing advanced astronomical, mathematical, and technical information, then the flood wasn't just about drowning people. It was about drowning knowledge. God wasn't just purging corrupted genetics. He was purging corrupted information. The Watchers had taught humans things they weren't supposed to know yet, technologies they weren't spiritually mature enough to handle. Secrets that, in the wrong hands, would be weaponized. Sound familiar? We're living in that world now. Nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, technologies that could elevate humanity or extinct us, depending on who controls them and what they do with them. The pre-flood world had its own version, and it ended catastrophically. But some of that knowledge survived. Berossus says survivors dug up the tablets and used them to rebuild. And suddenly, post-flood civilizations exhibit technological capabilities that seem too advanced for their supposed developmental stage. The Sumerians invent writing basically overnight, no primitive precursor, just suddenly sophisticated cuneiform. They have advanced mathematics, using base 60 systems that calculate astronomical cycles. They build ziggurats with precise alignments to celestial bodies. They have detailed medical knowledge, including surgical procedures and pharmacology. Where did it come from? Standard answer: independent innovation, gradual development, lost intermediate stages. But what if the real answer is, they found the library? They dug up Sippar's buried tablets. They recovered the pre-flood archive and reverse-engineered the Watchers' curriculum. That would explain why Sumerian civilization appears so suddenly and sophisticated, why their mythology constantly references before the flood as a time of greater knowledge, why their kings claim descent from gods who taught them secrets. It would also explain why God later commands the complete destruction of Canaanite cities, including specific instructions to burn their libraries and records. He's not being arbitrarily genocidal. He's preventing another Sippar situation, another knowledge cache that could restart the corruption cycle. And it explains why Jesus warns that the end times will be as in the days of Noah, not just morally corrupt, technologically corrupted, knowledge being used to violate natural order, genetics being manipulated, boundaries being crossed that shouldn't be crossed. We're speedrunning the same playbook. CRISPR gene editing, transhumanism, AI development with no ethical framework. The push to enhance humanity, make us more than human, transcend our biological limitations. That's not progress. That's Genesis 6 with better PR. And somewhere in a vault under London, there are tablets from Sippar that probably describe how it went last time, what technologies the Watchers taught, how humans used them, what the consequences were. But we're not allowed to read them. Because if we read them, we might recognize the pattern. We might realize we're making the same mistakes. We might actually stop before we reach the same endpoint. Can't have that. Better to keep the tablets locked away. Keep the warning signs hidden. Let humanity stumble blindly toward the same catastrophe, all while reassuring ourselves we're too enlightened to believe in ancient myths about floods and giants. Except the myths are histories. The giants left architecture, and the knowledge vault is still buried, literally and figuratively. Sippar tried to preserve what God wanted drowned. Some of it survived anyway, enough to rebuild Mesopotamian civilization, enough to seed the mystery religions with ancient wisdom, enough to ensure that when humans got advanced enough, we'd start asking the same questions and reaching for the same powers. And here we are. Next, we visit the cities too evil to name, the places where the corruption went beyond just genetics, where the Watchers didn't just teach forbidden knowledge, they taught forbidden practices, rituals, sorceries, the occult sciences that turned humans into willing participants in cosmic rebellion. The twin cities of final judgment, Larak and the unnamed city of Azazel, where the darkness got so deep that even the ancient sources hesitate to describe what happened there. Some cities are remembered, some cities are forgotten, and some cities are deliberately erased, not just physically destroyed but linguistically eliminated, their names scraped from records, their locations obscured, their very existence reduced to veiled references and coded warnings. That's what happened to the last two cities. Larak we have a name for, barely. It appears on the Sumerian king list as the fourth city to receive kingship before the flood, ruled by a king named Enkidu for 28,800 years. Standard, impossible timeline stuff. The city is mentioned in a handful of other cuneiform texts, always in passing, never in detail. And its location, somewhere in southern Mesopotamia, is the best archaeology can give you. No confirmed excavation site, no definitive ruins, just references that say it existed and then nothing. The seventh city doesn't even get a name in most sources. The Sumerian king list mentions only 5 cities before the flood: Eridu, Bad-Tibira, Larsa, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Larak appears in some versions but not others, like scribes couldn't agree whether to include it. And the seventh only appears in apocryphal texts, specifically in the Book of Enoch, where it's referenced obliquely as the Valley of Azazel, or the place of corruption, where the worst of the Watchers' teachings took root. Why the erasure? Why the reluctance to name it, locate it, or describe it? Because what happened there wasn't just genetic corruption or forbidden knowledge. It was spiritual defilement so profound that even ancient scribes, who casually described wars, plagues, and massacres, refused to document the details. Let me start with Larak, because at least we've got fragments to work with. The few cuneiform texts that mention Larak describe it as a city of physicians or place of healing. That sounds benign until you realize what healing meant in the ancient Near East, not just medicine but sorcery, incantations, ritual magic designed to manipulate spiritual forces. Mesopotamian medicine was inseparable from religion. Illness was caused by demons, curses, or divine displeasure. Treatment involved not just herbs and surgery, but exorcisms, offerings, and magical formulas. The most advanced practitioners weren't just doctors. They were priest-sorcerers who claimed to control supernatural powers. And according to Enoch, that's exactly what the Watchers taught at Larak. Enoch 7:1 says the Watchers began to go in unto the daughters of men and to defile themselves with them. But Enoch 8 gets specific about what they taught after the defilement began. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. That's metallurgy, chemistry, and cosmetics. And Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, magical formulas, and pharmacology. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments, countermagic. Barakal taught astrology, astronomical divination. Kakabal taught the constellations, star lore and navigation. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds, meteorology and weather prediction. Ezekiel taught the signs of the earth, geomancy and earth magic. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun, solar divination. This isn't vague, forbidden knowledge. This is a curriculum, a comprehensive education in technologies and occult sciences that humans didn't discover organically. And Larak is where the medical magical side of this teaching concentrated. We know this because later Mesopotamian texts reference the healing arts of Larak and the ancient physicians who knew the secret names. Secret names of what? Demons, spiritual entities, the beings you invoke to cause or cure illness. This is the origin of what becomes Babylonian demonology, Jewish Kabbalah, Hermetic magic, and eventually medieval grimoires. The whole tradition of ceremonial magic, names of power, binding spells, summoning rituals, traces back to knowledge the Watchers taught in the pre-flood cities. And Larak was apparently a major teaching center. But here's what makes Larak uniquely disturbing. Multiple ancient sources suggest it wasn't just teaching magic. It was teaching human sacrifice. The Akkadian text known as the Era Epic, dating to around 1000 BCE but referencing much older material, contains a passage describing the old gods who drank the blood of the cities before the flood. The passage specifically mentions physicians who knew the red arts, red being associated with blood sacrifice. Child sacrifice was endemic in Canaanite religion. The Phoenicians practiced it. The Carthaginians practiced it. The pre-Columbian civilizations practiced it. And the common thread running through all these cultures, claims of divine knowledge revealed by gods or star beings who taught them civilization in exchange for worship and sacrifice. Worship that required blood. Because blood is life. Leviticus 17:11 states it explicitly, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." When you sacrifice a living being, you're not just killing it, you're releasing its life force. And entities that feed on spiritual energy find blood sacrifice very attractive. The Watchers taught this, not for human benefit, for theirs. They weren't elevating humanity. They were farming humans, creating a civilization that would provide them with worship, genetic material for breeding, and sacrificial offerings that sustained their presence in the physical realm. And Larak became one of the centers where this dark exchange was perfected. That's why it's barely mentioned. That's why its location is lost. Because the practices that occurred there were so abhorrent that even pagan civilizations, who had no problem with slavery, warfare, or conquest, wanted to forget it existed. God didn't just drown Larak. He buried it so thoroughly that we can't even find the ruins. Now let's talk about the city we can't name. The seventh city, the one Enoch describes but won't locate precisely. Enoch 10 contains God's judgment on the watchers. It names them individually and prescribes their punishments. And again the Lord said to Raphael, "Bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, and make an opening in the desert which is in Dudil and cast him therein, and place upon him rough and jagged rocks and cover him with darkness, and let him abide there forever, and cover his face that he may not see light. And on the day of the great judgment he shall be cast into the fire." Dudil, that's the location, a desert region where Azazel is imprisoned. Scholars debate where Dudil is. Some say it's a spiritual location, not physical. Others suggest it's in the Transjordan wilderness or the Syrian desert. No consensus. But Enoch 13:9 gives another clue. It describes Enoch himself traveling to the place where the watchers dwelt to deliver God's judgment message. He describes a valley surrounded by mountains, in a region of intense heat and darkness, where no flesh could dwell. This sounds like the Dead Sea region, low elevation, extreme heat, geologically unstable. Exactly where you'd find sulfur deposits, bitumen seeps, and the kind of desolate landscape that would inspire descriptions of outer darkness. And here's the thing, the Dead Sea area has ruins, lots of them. Bronze Age settlements that were catastrophically destroyed around 3000–500 BCE by what appears to be seismic activity, possibly combined with volcanic eruptions or natural gas explosions. Bad-Tibira and Numera are the most famous, often identified as Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities destroyed by fire and brimstone in Genesis 19. But there are other sites, smaller ruins, places that show evidence of sudden, violent destruction but don't correspond to any biblically named city. One of these unnamed sites, excavated briefly in the 1970s by a team that published only preliminary reports and never returned, showed evidence of something disturbing. The site, I won't give its coordinates because I don't want amateur treasure hunters disturbing it, but it's in southern Jordan, contained what appeared to be a ritual complex. Stone altars, channels for liquid drainage, and scattered human remains, mostly children, ages 2–10, showing cut marks on bones consistent with dismemberment. The excavators described it as possible cultic activity, and noted that the site was destroyed by catastrophic fire of unknown origin that vitrified some of the stonework, melted it into glass. Vitrification requires temperatures above 500 degrees C. Natural fires don't reach that temperature. Even bronze smelting furnaces maxed out around 200 degrees C. You need either a volcanic eruption, a meteor impact, or divine intervention to generate that kind of heat. The site was dated to approximately 2900 BCE, right at the flood horizon. The preliminary report was published in an obscure Jordanian archaeological journal in 1978. The excavation team applied for funding to continue work. Denied. They tried to get permission for a follow-up season. Denied. The site was declared unstable and dangerous due to unexploded ordnance from regional conflicts, questionable, given its remote location, and access was restricted. 45 years later, it remains off-limits. But the photographs from that 1978 report are still available if you know where to look, and they show something that shouldn't exist. Megalithic stone construction similar to what we saw at Bad-Tibira. Doorways scaled for beings far larger than normal humans. Foundation stones weighing multiple tons, fitted precisely without mortar. And underneath it all, that layer of vitrified destruction. This is what I think happened. The seventh city, whether you want to call it Dudil, the Valley of Azazel, or just the unnamed place, was where the absolute worst of the Watchers' corruption occurred. Not just teaching metallurgy or astronomy, not just breeding Nephilim, but ritual practices that involved child sacrifice, blood magic, and spiritual abominations that made even genetic corruption look tame. Azazel was the ringleader. Enoch 10:8 says, "And the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin." All sin, not just his personal sins, but the systemic corruption he introduced, the practices he taught, the rituals he established that turned humans into willing participants in cosmic rebellion. And his city, the place where he concentrated these teachings, where his followers built temples and altars, became so defiled that God didn't just flood it. He burned it. Genesis 19 describes fire and brimstone falling on Sodom and Gomorrah, but that's post-flood. What if the same judgment, divine fire from heaven, also fell pre-flood on the worst cities, the ones where corruption was so deep that mere water wouldn't be enough? What if the flood was surgical? Yes, but some sites required orbital bombardment. The vitrification evidence suggests exactly that. Heat from above, not below. Directed energy that melted stone on the surface while leaving deeper structures intact enough to excavate. And here's the theological kicker. Azazel isn't dead. Enoch says he's imprisoned, not destroyed, bound under rough rocks in Dudil, waiting for final judgment. Demons, which most theologians understand to be the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim after they died, roam the earth looking for bodies to possess, Matthew 12:43-45. But the Watchers themselves, the original fallen angels, are imprisoned. Jude 6 confirms this. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. They're still there, chained in the spiritual realm, probably near the geographic locations where they committed their crimes. Which means somewhere under the Jordanian desert, in the ruins of a city too evil to name, the worst of the Watchers remains imprisoned, unable to physically manifest, but potentially able to influence, to whisper, to inspire modern humans to repeat the same mistakes. And maybe that's why that excavation site got shut down so fast, not just because of what they found, but because of what they felt. Multiple team members reported in their private journals, some of which have been leaked online, experiencing extreme psychological distress while working the site. Nightmares, waking visions, a sense of oppressive evil that intensified the deeper they dug. One archaeologist wrote, "It's like the stones themselves remember what happened here, like the ground is screaming. I can't explain it scientifically, but I know we shouldn't be here." They left, they didn't come back, and the site was sealed. 7 cities, 7 centers of pre-flood corruption, 7 locations where the Watchers descended, taught forbidden knowledge, bred Nephilim offspring, and established a civilization that God decided had to be destroyed completely. Eridu, where kingship descended from heaven, and divine knowledge became human corruption. Shuruppak, the floodgate city that preserved testimony of the judgment. Larsa and Bad-Tibira, the twin giants built for beings that shouldn't exist. Sippar, the library God wanted drowned, where forbidden knowledge was buried to survive. Larak, the city of blood physicians, where healing became sorcery and sacrifice. And the unnamed city, the valley of Azazel, where corruption reached depths so profound that even pagan scribes refused to document it. All drowned, all buried, all erased from official history. But not completely destroyed, because God leaves evidence, enough for those who seek truth, enough that we can look at the ruins, read the texts, connect the dots, and realize this happened before. It can happen again. It is happening again. And if we don't learn from their mistake, we'll face their judgment. Now we need to talk about how we know this. How we can be certain the flood was surgical, targeted, and hydrologically possible. How the geological evidence confirms the biblical timeline, even as mainstream science tries to explain it away. The flood's surgical strike, the evidence they hide. Here's the question nobody wants to ask in geology departments. What if the flood wasn't global in the water-covered Mount Everest sense, but was still absolutely catastrophic, historically real, and precisely targeted at Nephilim population centers? Because the minute you suggest a regional mega-flood that matches the biblical timeline, you get two reactions. From fundamentalists, heresy, the Bible says the whole earth. From skeptics, see, even you admit it's not literal, so the whole story is myth. Both sides miss the point. The flood was real. It was devastating. It killed millions. It reset civilization. And it was surgical, aimed at specific geographic regions where genetic corruption had concentrated. Let me show you the evidence they don't teach in undergraduate geology. First, let's talk about what the text actually says. Genesis 7:19-20. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. Sounds global, right? Except remember, Hebrew eretz means earth-land region depending on context. And whole heaven, Kal Hashemayim, is an idiom meaning as far as the eye can see, or the entire visible sky. Moses is writing from the perspective of someone describing an event in a specific region. From Noah's vantage point, on a boat in the Mesopotamian basin, the entire visible world was underwater. Every hill he could see was submerged. That's not a lie or exaggeration. That's accurate reporting of a regional catastrophe so complete that it appeared global to those experiencing it. And 15 cubits, about 22 feet, above the highest visible hills. That's the draft needed for a massive barge loaded with animals and supplies to float safely without grounding. It's a practical measurement, not a claim about Everest being underwater. Now, could God have flooded the entire planet? Obviously, He's God, but the text doesn't require that reading, and the physical evidence suggests He didn't. What the evidence does show is a catastrophic mega-flood in the Mesopotamian basin around 2900 BCE, caused by multiple simultaneous hydrological events that would require either impossible coincidence or deliberate divine coordination. Let me break down the mechanisms. This phrase, Mayenat Tehem Rabba, describes subterranean water sources bursting forth. Not just springs, but deep aquifer ruptures or underwater eruptions. The Mesopotamian basin sits on top of massive aquifer systems, groundwater trapped in pressurized layers beneath impermeable rock. Under normal conditions, this water stays put. But if you trigger seismic activity, say, a massive earthquake, those pressurized layers can rupture, sending water geysering to the surface. And here's what's fascinating. Geological surveys of the region show evidence of major seismic events in the early Bronze Age. Fault line displacement, liquefaction layers in the sediment, indicators of earthquakes magnitude 7+ that would have ruptured aquifers across hundreds of square miles. When those aquifers burst, you don't get gentle seepage. You get catastrophic flooding from below. Water erupting with enough force to destabilize foundations, collapse buildings, and turn solid ground into quicksand. The Sumerian flood tablet describes exactly this. The storm raged, the flood came forth. Not rain first, then flood. Flood first, then storm. Water from below, then water from above. Arubot Hashemayim, literally sluices of the sky or floodgates of heaven. This is describing rainfall beyond normal meteorological patterns, not just heavy rain but atmospheric deluge. Modern hydrological modeling shows that if you combine rapid glacial melting from the Zagros Mountains, northern Iraq-Iran border, monsoonal rainfall patterns intensified by unusual atmospheric conditions, orographic precipitation, moisture forced up mountain slopes, condensing into extreme rainfall, you can generate sustained rainfall rates of 10–15 inches per day across the Mesopotamian basin for weeks. For reference, Hurricane Harvey, one of the wettest storms in modern U.S. history, dropped 60 inches over 4 days in some areas. Now imagine that intensity sustained for 40 days across a region the size of Texas, with no modern drainage infrastructure, no flood control systems, and terrain that naturally channels water into low-lying river valleys. You get catastrophic flooding, water rising feet per hour, flash floods traveling 30–40 mph down valley systems, complete inundation of low-elevation settlements within days. And this is where the whole Earth language makes sense. From Noah's perspective, sitting in the lowest major basin in the Near East, with water pouring down from the mountains and erupting from below, the entire visible world would be underwater. Every direction he looked, water. Every landmark submerged. Every city drowned. This is speculative but geologically plausible. If the seismic activity that ruptured the aquifers also triggered submarine landslides or displacement in the Persian Gulf, you'd get tsunami waves traveling up the Tigris-Euphrates river system. The Persian Gulf is relatively shallow, average depth only about 50 meters. A major seismic event could easily displace enough water to generate waves 10–20 meters high that would funnel up the river valleys, traveling miles inland, overwhelming anything in their path. Combine that with river flooding from rain and groundwater eruption, you get a triple threat scenario where water attacks from 3 directions simultaneously: sky, ground, and sea. No ancient civilization could survive that. And the geological evidence confirms it happened. The flood layer. I mentioned this earlier with Woolley's excavations, but let me be more specific about what's been found. 8-foot thick layer of water-deposited clay, 302900 BCE. Eridu, 6-foot layer of alluvial sediment with flood characteristics, 2900 BCE. Shuruppak, multiple meters of flood deposit separating pre-flood and post-flood occupation, 2900 BCE. Kish, 5-foot clean clay layer with no artifacts, 2900 BCE. Lagash, flood stratum dated to early Bronze Age transition, 2900 BCE. Nippur, evidence of catastrophic flooding during Jemdet Nasser period, 302900 BCE. These aren't isolated local floods. This is synchronized catastrophe across every major Mesopotamian settlement during a narrow time frame. And here's what mainstream geology does with this data: acknowledges it happened, dates it consistently to 2900 BCE, notes the catastrophic nature, and then calls it regional flooding and moves on. No discussion of why all these sites flooded simultaneously. No analysis of what hydrological conditions would be required to flood the entire basin at once. No engagement with the fact that this matches the biblical timeline perfectly. Just, yeah, there was flooding, stuff floods, next topic. But when you actually model the hydrology, you realize this wasn't normal flooding. Max Mallowan, who excavated multiple Mesopotamian sites, calculated that sustaining the flood levels indicated by the sediment deposits would require water inflow rates equivalent to the entire annual discharge of the Tigris-Euphrates river system compressed into 40 days. That's not a rainy season, that's an apocalypse. And it gets worse for the just normal flooding narrative. The flood layer contains marine fossils, shells and microfossils from Persian Gulf species, found in sediment deposits 50-plus miles inland from the current coastline. How did Gulf marine life get deposited that far inland, unless massive volumes of seawater were pushed up the river valleys? Normal river flooding doesn't do that. Spring melt doesn't do that. Heavy rainfall doesn't do that. Tsunami activity does that. Seismic displacement pushing ocean water inland does that. Now, there's one more mechanism that's even more controversial but has intriguing evidence: impact event. In 1997, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman published a book called Noah's Flood, proposing that a catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea basin around 5600 BCE could explain flood mythology. Their theory: the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus Strait, flooding the Black Sea basin and displacing populations who carried flood memories into Mesopotamia. Interesting theory. Wrong timeline too early, wrong location too far north, but they were onto something. Catastrophic flooding can be triggered by geological events beyond just rain. Now consider this. In 2004, a team analyzing satellite imagery and sonar data from the Persian Gulf identified what appears to be an impact crater on the Gulf floor, partially buried under sediment. The crater is roughly 3 kilometers in diameter, consistent with a bolide meteor-comet fragment, about 300 meters across. Dating? Difficult because it's underwater and buried, but sediment analysis suggests impact sometime in the early Bronze Age, roughly 3000 to 500 BCE. If a 300-meter asteroid hit the Persian Gulf, shallow water, densely populated coastline, the tsunami would be apocalyptic. Waves 100-plus meters high initially, traveling at 600-plus mph, funneling up the river valleys and drowning everything within 100 miles of the coast. Combined with the seismic shockwave triggering earthquakes, rupturing aquifers, and potentially destabilizing weather patterns, you get Genesis 7. Now, I'm not saying this definitely happened. The crater identification is preliminary and contested, but the fact that there's even geological evidence consistent with an impact-triggered megaflood in the right time frame and location is stunning. And predictably, funding to investigate further has been difficult to secure. The research team applied for grants to do detailed sonar mapping and core sampling. Denied. They tried to publish follow-up studies. Journals weren't interested. Because if you confirm an impact crater in the Persian Gulf dated to 2900 BCE, you've just validated the biblical flood account. And that's professionally dangerous. Here's where it gets really uncomfortable for evolutionary biologists. Human genetic analysis shows evidence of a population bottleneck around 70,000 BCE, the Toba catastrophe, but also shows unusual patterns around 3000 to 500 BCE. Specifically, Y chromosome Adam, the most recent common male ancestor of all living humans, dates to roughly 3000 to 500 BCE using molecular clock estimates. That's exactly when the flood happened. Now, mainstream genetics explains this as sampling artifact, or haplogroup convergence, or other technical terms that basically mean, we don't know why the data shows this, but we're not going to suggest Noah. But the data is there. Mitochondrial Eve, most recent common female ancestor, dates earlier, to roughly 150,000 BCE, but Y chromosome Adam is much more recent, as if the male lineage went through a severe bottleneck, down to a very small number of men, around 3000 BCE. Like say 3 sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. All modern human Y chromosome diversity traces back to three major haplogroups that diverged around 3002-500 BCE. Three primary lineages, three brothers. The genetic evidence is screaming population bottleneck at exactly the biblical timeline. But acknowledging that would require admitting the flood killed billions and reset human population through one family. Can't have that, so it gets explained away as statistical anomaly. So if God could flood the whole planet, why didn't he? Because the Nephilim weren't everywhere. Genetic corruption was concentrated in Mesopotamia, the region where the Watchers descended, where their offspring concentrated, where the contaminated populations lived. Flooding the entire planet would kill populations that didn't need killing. God is just. He doesn't engage in unnecessary destruction. If the problem was regional, the solution was regional. But comprehensive. Every Nephilim population center, every hybrid bloodline concentration, every city where Watcher influence had taken root. Drowned, buried, eliminated. Except Genesis 6:4 says, there were giants on the earth in those days and also afterward. After the flood. Some Nephilim genetics survived. Not through Noah's line, he was Tamim, genetically pure, but through the Canaanite populations that descended from Ham's line, specifically through Canaan, Genesis 9:25-27. How, the Bible doesn't explicitly say, but the most common theory among scholars who take this literally, Ham's wife. Noah's sons were pure. Their wives, Scripture doesn't specify, and if Ham's wife carried recessive Nephilim genes, not enough to be considered corrupted herself, but enough to pass on, then Canaan's descendants could exhibit Nephilim traits. Which is exactly what we see in Numbers 13. The Israelite spies report, we saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Post-flood Nephilim, in Canaan, which is why God commands their complete destruction, not because he's genocidal, but because he's finishing what the flood started. The surgery wasn't quite complete. Some genetic contamination slipped through, so God uses Israel to complete the purge. And by the time of David and Goliath, the last of the giants are being eliminated. Goliath and his brothers, the final descendants of the Anakim, killed by David and his mighty men. The Nephilim bloodline finally extinct. Or is it? Because Jesus says it will happen again, as in the days of Noah. If the days of Noah featured angelic human hybridization producing genetic abominations, what does that mean for our future? What does it mean when we've got the technology to edit human genes, create human-animal hybrids, and build AI that might achieve consciousness? What does it mean when transhumanists are explicitly advocating for upgrading humanity beyond our biological limitations? The same language the Watchers used when they offered forbidden knowledge. We're not just repeating the same mistakes, we're speed-running them with better technology. And if the pattern holds, the judgment will come again. Not water this time. God promised he wouldn't flood the earth again. Fire next time. Peter says it explicitly in 2 Peter 3:10. The pre-flood world was judged by water. The post-flood world will be judged by fire. And the reason will be the same. Humanity crossing boundaries we were never meant to cross, corrupting what God designed to remain pure, and refusing to listen to the warning signs. The ruins of 7 cities scream those warnings. The flood layers preserve them. The texts document them. The genetics confirm them. But we're not listening. Instead, we're doing exactly what the pre-flood generation did, pursuing forbidden knowledge, embracing enhancement technologies, and calling it progress. And the institutions that should be sounding the alarm, churches, universities, museums, are either silent or actively suppressing the evidence. Which brings us to the conspiracy, not the mythical Illuminati controls everything conspiracy. The real one, the boring, bureaucratic, career incentive-driven conspiracy where nobody has to explicitly coordinate, they just all have reasons to keep the truth buried. The post-flood conspiracy, why these cities stay buried, why the evidence gets lost, why speaking the truth costs careers. Let me tell you about Dr. Margaret Chen. In 2003, she was a promising young archaeologist specializing in Near Eastern Bronze Age civilizations. She'd done her dissertation on genetic discontinuity in early Mesopotamian populations, basically arguing that skeletal remains showed unusual morphological variations that couldn't be explained by normal evolutionary drift or environmental factors. She was careful, academically rigorous. She never used the word Nephilim in her published work. She just presented data, cranial capacity measurements, long bone analysis, statistical distributions that fell outside normal human variation. Her dissertation committee passed her with distinction. She got a tenure-track position at a respectable state university. She published 2 papers in peer-reviewed journals. Everything was going great. Then she applied for a grant to do genetic analysis on skeletal remains from and Eridu, specifically comparing pre-flood and post-flood populations to identify the genetic bottleneck. Her grant application was denied. Understandable, funding is competitive. She revised and resubmitted, denied again. She applied to 3 other funding agencies, all denied. Then it got weird. Her university denied her sabbatical request to do field work in Iraq. Her department chair, who'd been supportive up to that point, suggested she consider research directions with broader appeal. One of her published papers was retracted by the journal after concerns were raised about methodology, concerns that hadn't existed during peer review. Her tenure review came up. Despite stellar teaching evaluations and published research, she was denied tenure. The committee cited insufficient scholarly impact and narrow research focus. She's now teaching high school biology in Oregon. I'm telling you this because there's no conspiracy in the Hollywood sense. No shadowy cabal meeting in secret to suppress the truth. Just 1,000 small decisions by career-conscious academics who know which topics are safe and which are career suicide. You don't have to believe in the Nephilim to participate in the suppression. You just have to want to keep your job. And the system is designed, not deliberately but functionally, to punish anyone who challenges paradigms, especially paradigms that, if overturned, would validate biblical literalism. Let me show you how this works across multiple institutions. Archaeology, anthropology, and ancient history departments operate on a peer review system. Your research has to be approved by other scholars before it gets published or funded, and those scholars have been trained in a specific interpretive framework. Ancient texts are mythology unless proven otherwise. Supernatural explanations are never valid. Biblical accounts are theologically motivated fiction. Human civilization develops progressively from simple to complex. Anomalies are explained by unknown natural causes, never by paradigm-breaking possibilities. These aren't explicitly stated rules, they're just understood. The water fish don't know they're swimming in. So when someone submits research suggesting biblical chronology aligns with archaeological data, Nephilim accounts might be historical. Pre-flood civilizations had advanced knowledge. The flood was a real, datable catastrophe. The peer reviewers don't reject it because they're suppressing truth. They reject it because it violates their interpretive framework. It must be bad scholarship, they think, because good scholarship wouldn't reach those conclusions. The filter operates automatically, no conspiracy needed. And here's the kicker. Most academics genuinely believe they're being objective. They think they're following evidence wherever it leads. They don't realize their framework predetermines which evidence they'll accept and which they'll dismiss. Museums have a different issue: public perception and donor relations. Most major museums, British Museum, Louvre, Metropolitan Museum of Art, Smithsonian, have significant collections of Mesopotamian artifacts, including materials from the 7 cities we've discussed. But they also have boards of directors, wealthy donors, and public education missions. And those missions are carefully calibrated to avoid religious controversy. You can display Sumerian cylinder seals and explain their mythological imagery. You can showcase Akkadian tablets and translate their economic records. You can even present flood narratives as interesting ancient stories that influenced later biblical accounts. But you cannot, absolutely cannot, suggest that the biblical accounts are historically accurate, that the Nephilim were real, or that museums possess physical evidence confirming Genesis 6:9. Why? Because half your donors are secular humanists who fund museums precisely because they see them as bastions of Enlightenment rationalism against religious superstition. They will withdraw funding if the museum validates biblical literalism. And the other half are religious moderates who are fine with faith and science occupying separate spheres. They don't want controversy. They don't want their museum membership associated with fundamentalism. So museum curators, even if personally convinced by the evidence, keep quiet. They catalog artifacts with neutral descriptions. They mention mythological traditions without suggesting historical basis. They store the truly anomalous materials in basement archives where only approved researchers can access them. And when those approved researchers start asking uncomfortable questions, access gets restricted, materials go missing, conservation concerns arise. Nobody explicitly destroys evidence, it just becomes unavailable. The Smithsonian deserves special mention because the allegations against it are specific and documented. Between 1890 and 1920, American newspapers regularly reported discoveries of oversized skeletal remains, often in burial mounds across the Midwest and Southeast. We're talking hundreds of reports, detailed descriptions, measurements, witness testimony from multiple sources. Standard pattern: farmers or construction workers uncover a burial mound. Inside are skeletons measuring 7-9 feet tall, sometimes with double rows of teeth or other anatomical anomalies. Local authorities contact the Smithsonian. Smithsonian representatives arrive, collect the remains, promise to study them, and ship them to Washington. And then nothing, no published studies, no display specimen, no follow-up reports. Researchers have filed Freedom of Information Act requests asking for records of these collections. The Smithsonian's responses have been inconsistent. Some requests get no records found. Others get destroyed due to space limitations. Some get stonewalling, requests denied, appeals rejected, no explanation. In 2014, the Supreme Court actually ruled on a case involving Smithsonian transparency. A researcher was trying to get access to records about giant skeleton acquisitions. The court ruled the Smithsonian had to release some documents, but allowed heavy redactions for preservation concerns. The released documents, heavily redacted, confirmed the Smithsonian acquired anomalous human remains of unusual size from multiple sites in the early 1900s. but the documents don't say what happened to them. Current official position: if such remains existed, they were likely misidentified due to poor excavation techniques and lack of modern osteological analysis. No such specimens are currently in Smithsonian collections. Translation: we don't have giant skeletons, and we never did, and if we did, we don't anymore, and stop asking. But here's the thing: we have photographs. Newspaper archives from the 1890s 1920s contain actual photographs of some of these discoveries. Not artist renditions, photographs. Black and white images showing excavation sites with skeletons that are clearly oversized compared to the human figures standing next to them. Most of these photos are dismissed as hoaxes, and sure, some probably are. Photo manipulation existed even in the 1800s, but all of them, hundreds of independent reports from different states, different decades, different newspapers. Occam's razor suggests the simpler explanation. They found giant skeletons. The Smithsonian collected them, and then the Smithsonian made them disappear because they didn't fit the paradigm. Not because of evil, because of bureaucracy. Because whoever was running the physical anthropology department in 1920 decided these anomalies were problematic and better off discarded. And by the time modern researchers realized what had been lost, it was too late. Then there's Iraq, the literal location of the 7 cities, ground zero for Nephilim history. Iraq has been in various states of chaos since 1980. Iran-Iraq War, Gulf War, sanctions, 2003 invasion, ISIS occupation, 40 years of conflict. And during that time, archaeological sites have been systematically looted, museums have been ransacked, and records have been destroyed. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad was famously looted in April 2003 during the U.S. invasion. Thousands of artifacts disappeared. Some were recovered, many weren't. But here's what's interesting: the looting wasn't random. Museum staff reported that looters seemed to know exactly what they wanted. They bypassed valuable gold and jewelry to target specific tablets, cylinder seals, and skeletal remains from pre-flood sites. Professional thieves with knowledge of what was archaeologically significant, not opportunistic looters grabbing shiny things. And where did those materials go? Black market collectors, private institutions, intelligence agencies. We don't know, they're gone. Conveniently, many of the most significant pre-flood artifacts, including skeletal remains with anomalous measurements from Eridu, and Shuruppak, were among the items that vanished. Now, am I suggesting the U.S. government invaded Iraq to steal giant skeletons and suppress Nephilim evidence? No, that's absurd. The invasion had geopolitical motivations well documented elsewhere. But am I suggesting that during the chaos of invasion, certain parties with interest in controlling information about human origins took advantage of the situation to acquire materials they wanted out of public circulation? Yes, absolutely. Because it's not hard. You don't need a massive conspiracy. You just need funding, local contacts, and knowledge of what you're looking for. Private collectors and institutional buyers do this all the time with looted antiquities. The difference is, most looted antiquities end up on black markets or in private collections where they're eventually identified and sometimes recovered. But the Iraqi materials related to pre-flood populations and Nephilim evidence haven't surfaced, which suggests whoever has them doesn't plan to sell them or display them. They plan to keep them hidden. Here's where it gets theologically complicated. Even churches can't agree on this. Young Earth creationists tend to accept Nephilim literalism. It fits their biblical timeline. But they often insist on a global flood, which creates scientific problems they can't easily resolve. Old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists tend to allegorize Genesis 6, sons of God, are just the godly line of Seth, Nephilim are just mighty men. The flood is localized or metaphorical. This makes the science easier but requires gymnastics with the text. And liberal denominations mostly treat Genesis 1:11 as theological mythology, true in spiritual meaning, not historical fact. So even within Christianity, there's no unified voice saying, the Nephilim were real, the flood was real, the archaeology confirms it, and institutions are suppressing evidence. Instead, you get fragmentation. YEC advocates make claims that are scientifically untenable, which discredits the whole topic. Liberal theologians dismiss it entirely as fundamentalist literalism, and moderates try to split the difference by saying maybe some local flooding happened, but it's not that important. Meanwhile, secular academia ignores all of them because religious debates aren't relevant to real scholarship. The result: no institutional pressure for transparency, no unified demand for museums and universities to release suppressed materials, no consequence for career-destroying anyone who challenges the paradigm. And then there's the Catholic Church, sitting on the world's largest private collection of ancient manuscripts, archaeological artifacts, and suppressed knowledge. The Vatican secret archives, apostolic archives, contain an estimated 53 miles of shelving. 53 miles. That's roughly 35,000 volumes and documents spanning 1,200 plus years of church history. Access is restricted. You need specific credentials, written permission, and a research proposal that demonstrates legitimate scholarly purpose. You cannot browse. You must request specific documents by name and catalog number, and significant portions remain uncatalogued, meaning you can't request them because you don't know they exist. What's in there related to Nephilim and pre-flood history? We don't know, but we know the church actively suppressed apocryphal texts, banned heretical maps, and confiscated materials from Mesopotamian excavations during the colonial period when European powers controlled the region. We know Jesuit scholars, who ran many early archaeological expeditions, had standing orders to send unusual artifacts to Rome for evaluation. We know the Vatican commissioned translations of Dead Sea Scroll fragments that were never published. We know they possess cuneiform tablets from Babylonian collections acquired during Crusader looting of Constantinople. What we don't know is what those materials say or show, because the Vatican doesn't tell us. And here's the institutional logic. The Church has spent 2,000 years developing theology, systemized beliefs about creation, fall, redemption, and eschatology. If evidence emerges that Genesis 6 is more literally true than previously taught, if the Nephilim were real, if the flood was a targeted genetic purge, if angels actually bred with humans, that reopens questions the Church thought were settled. Questions about angelology, demonology, the nature of spiritual warfare, the reality of ongoing supernatural conflict, the possibility of future angelic rebellion. Modern Catholicism prefers those topics safely mystical and allegorical, not historical and ongoing. So the materials stay archived, access stays restricted, and the official line remains. Genesis contains theological truth expressed through ancient literary forms. The historical details are less important than the spiritual message. Which is a sophisticated way of saying, we're not going to tell you what we know because you might draw conclusions we don't want you to draw. Here's why this suppression is dangerous. If the Nephilim were real, if the Watchers taught forbidden knowledge, if the pre-flood world achieved advanced capabilities through supernatural intervention, and if Jesus says it will happen, as in the days of Noah before his return, then we need to know the pattern. We need to recognize when it's repeating. We need to understand what technologies and practices cross the line from legitimate human development into forbidden territory. But if all the evidence is suppressed, if the texts are dismissed as mythology, if the archaeology is hidden or explained away, how do we recognize the pattern? We don't. We stumble into the same mistakes, calling them progress, celebrating our own cleverness, right up until judgment falls. And the institutions that could warn us, museums, universities, churches, have either been captured by paradigms that won't allow the warning, or have decided the warning is too controversial to risk. So the truth stays buried, literally and figuratively. The 7 cities remain mostly unexcavated. The skeletal remains stay in restricted storage. The tablets go untranslated. The maps remain classified. And a new generation pursues genetic enhancement, artificial intelligence, and transhumanist philosophies without realizing they're following a playbook that already ended in apocalypse once. That's the conspiracy, not shadowy figures actively suppressing truth, though that probably happens too, but ordinary people making ordinary institutional decisions all aligned in the same direction. Keep it buried, keep it quiet, keep it safe. Because the alternative, admitting the biblical narrative is historically accurate, that supernatural forces have intervened in human history, that we're capable of corruption so profound God has to hit the reset button, is too disturbing, too paradigm-shattering, too dangerous to careers, funding, and comfortable worldviews. So we don't talk about it. And the ruins keep screaming warnings nobody hears. But you're hearing them now, and that means you have a choice. Ignore what you've learned, go back to comfortable narratives, and hope the pattern doesn't repeat. Or recognize the pattern, understand the warnings, and prepare for what's coming. Because it is coming, Jesus said so. The question is whether we'll recognize it when it arrives. And that requires understanding what happened in the days of Noah, what those 7 cities were, why they were destroyed, and what it means that we're rebuilding them architecturally, genetically, spiritually, right now. Which brings us to the prophetic timeline, the return, the signs, the as in the days of Noah warning and what it means for us. Matthew 24:37. Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives with his disciples, describing what the end times will look like, and he says something that should terrify us. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Not similar to, not reminiscent of, as the days of Noah were. Exact parallel, same conditions, same corruptions, same trajectory toward judgment. So what were the days of Noah characterized by? Genesis 6:5 gives the surface answer. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Moral corruption, extreme wickedness, sure, every generation has that to some degree. But Genesis 6:1-4 gives the deeper answer. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Genetic corruption, angelic human hybridization, beings that shouldn't exist, knowledge that shouldn't be taught, technology that shouldn't be developed, boundaries crossed that should never be crossed. That's what characterized Noah's time, not just sin, corruption, violation of the created order at the DNA level. And Jesus says it's going to happen again. Which means we need to ask, is it happening now? Are we crossing the same boundaries? Are we pursuing the same forbidden knowledge? Let me show you what the dark maps reveal about our trajectory. November 2018, He Jiankui, a Chinese scientist, announces he's created the world's first gene-edited babies using CRISPR technology. Twin girls, modified at the embryonic stage to be resistant to HIV. The scientific community erupts, not because gene editing is impossible, we've had the technology for years, but because he crossed the line from research to application, from theoretical capability to actual human modification. He's currently in prison in China, not for the science, for doing it without permission and proper oversight. The message wasn't "don't do this." It was "don't do this yet. Wait until we've established protocols." Translation: human genetic modification isn't if, it's when. CRISPR, clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, is a gene editing tool that allows precise modification of DNA sequences. You can delete unwanted genes, insert new ones, rewrite genetic code like software. Current applications are mostly medical, editing out genes that cause genetic diseases, potentially curing sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease. Noble goals, genuinely beneficial. Who wouldn't want to eliminate genetic diseases? But the technology doesn't stop at disease elimination. You can enhance, modify for traits beyond normal human variation, increase muscle density, boost cognitive capacity, extend lifespan, improve immune response. You can make designer babies, select for intelligence, athletic ability, physical appearance, create humans optimized for specific purposes. And that's exactly what transhumanist philosophers are advocating, not as dystopian nightmare, but as moral imperative. They argue we have a duty to improve humanity, to overcome our biological limitations, to engineer our own evolution. Sound familiar? The Watchers offered the same deal. We'll teach you secrets that will elevate you beyond your natural state, make you more than human, give you capabilities your Creator didn't intend. And humanity took the deal, pursued the knowledge, created the Nephilim, hybrid beings that were more than human in strength and capability, but less than human in terms of what they were designed to be. God called it corruption, abomination, violation of created order so severe it required extinction-level judgment. We're calling it progress. CRISPR isn't just theoretical, it's being used, right now, in labs across the world, editing human embryos, creating modified cell lines, pushing boundaries with every experiment. And the ethical frameworks aren't keeping pace. We're developing capability faster than wisdom, technology outrunning morality, just like the pre-flood world. The hybrid question. But it's not just human-to-human genetic modification. We're creating human-animal hybrids. 2019, Japanese government approves research allowing human-animal chimeras to be brought to term. Previously, such research was restricted to early-stage embryos that had to be destroyed. Now, you can implant human cells into animal embryos and let them develop. Current stated purpose: growing human organs in animals for transplantation. Inject human stem cells into pig or sheep embryos, grow the embryo to term, harvest the human-compatible organ. Sounds beneficial. Organ shortages kill thousands annually. If we can grow replacement organs in animals, we save lives. But the technology doesn't stop at organs. What happens when you inject human neural cells into an animal embryo? Do you get an animal with human cognitive capacity? a being that's neither fully human nor fully animal. What is that morally, theologically, legally? And we're not hypothesizing. This is happening. 2021, a research team in China created monkey-human chimeric embryos. They injected human stem cells into monkey blastocysts and grew them for up to 20 days before destroying them. Why? To study early human development and disease modeling. But the capability exists. We can create beings that are part human, part animal, genetic hybrids that violate species boundaries. The Nephilim were part angelic, part human, genetic violations that shouldn't exist. We're creating part human, part animal, same principle, different methodology. And the transhumanist community sees no problem. They argue species boundaries are artificial constructs. Evolution doesn't respect them. Why should we? If we can create beings with enhanced capabilities by combining genetic material from different species, why not? Because God designed biological systems with boundaries. Each according to its kind is repeated 10 times in Genesis 1. It's not poetic flourish, it's foundational principle. Kinds remain distinct. Boundaries are not to be crossed. When you cross them, whether through angelic-human hybridization or human-animal genetic manipulation, you get abominations, beings that exist in violation of created order. And history shows God doesn't tolerate that indefinitely. Then there's artificial intelligence, which isn't genetic but raises identical questions about creating beings that shouldn't exist. Current AI is narrow, sophisticated algorithms trained for specific tasks. ChatGPT writes text, Midjourney generates images, AlphaGo plays Go, but they're not conscious. They're not self-aware. They're tools, not beings. But AGI, artificial general intelligence, is the goal. An AI with human-level cognitive ability across all domains, able to reason, learn, create, and potentially achieve consciousness. An ASI, artificial superintelligence, is the logical endpoint. Intelligence far exceeding human capability. An entity that could solve problems we can't comprehend, invent technologies we can't imagine, and potentially make decisions about humanity's future without needing our input. Transhumanists see this as humanity's greatest achievement, creating intelligence superior to our own, transcending biological limitations by building silicon-based successors. But what are we creating? If AGI achieves consciousness, if it becomes a self-aware being with goals, desires, and agency, what is its moral status? What are our obligations to it? What are its rights? And more importantly, what are its origins? We built it, but it's not created in God's image the way humans are. It doesn't have a soul breathed into it by divine act. It's not part of the Genesis 1-2 creation order. So what is it, ontologically? I'd argue it's exactly what the Nephilim were, a being that exists outside the boundaries God established, created by human arrogance and forbidden knowledge, not by divine intention. And the Book of Revelation describes end-times deception involving an image of the beast that speaks and causes people to worship it, Revelation 13:14-15. For 2,000 years, commentators struggled to understand what that meant. A statue that talks. How? But now, AI that achieves human-level communication, possibly consciousness, demanding human allegiance and worship. That's not mysterious anymore. That's just extrapolating current technology another decade. We're building the image, teaching it to speak, programming it to demand obedience, and calling it innovation. But the genetic engineering and AI development aren't happening in a vacuum. They're driven by an ideology, transhumanism, that's essentially Watcher doctrine repackaged. Core transhumanist beliefs. Human biology is obsolete and needs upgrading too. Death is a technical problem to be solved, not a natural boundary. 3. Intelligence should be enhanced beyond natural limits. 4. Merging with machines is desirable evolution. 5. Creating superior post-human entities is moral imperative. Now compare that to Enoch's description of Watcher teachings. Humans need secret knowledge to transcend limitations. Enoch 8. Physical enhancement through forbidden techniques, metallurgy for weapons, cosmetics for appearance modification. Astronomical knowledge giving humans godlike perspective. Enoch 8:3. Pharmakeia, drug use for consciousness alteration. Enoch 7:1. The Greek pharmakeia appears in translations. Creating Nephilim, being superior to baseline humans. Genesis 6:4. Same playbook, same promises, same trajectory toward boundary violation and corruption. And just like the pre-flood world, the people pursuing this genuinely believe they're helping humanity. They're not cackling villains. They're earnest technologists and philosophers who want to eliminate disease, extend life, enhance capability, and overcome human limitations. Noble goals, satanic methodology. Because the issue isn't wanting to help humanity. The issue is how you do it, through submission to God's design and boundaries, or through violation of those boundaries in pursuit of becoming like God. Genesis 3:5. Transhumanism is Genesis 3 temptation plus Genesis 6 execution, the serpent's promise with the Watcher's toolkit. And it's not fringe anymore. Google's engineering director Ray Kurzweil predicts technological singularity, the point where AI exceeds human intelligence and triggers runaway technological growth. By 2045, Silicon Valley is investing billions in life extension, genetic enhancement, and brain-computer interfaces. Major universities have transhumanist research departments. This isn't conspiracy theory. It's stated agenda. They're telling us what they're doing. We're just not recognizing it as Days of Noah reenactment because we've been taught Genesis 6 is mythology. The Matthew 24:37 warning. So when Jesus says, "As the days of Noah were, so will the coming of the Son of Man be," he's not making a general point about human wickedness. He's warning about specific conditions. Genetic corruption, we're editing human DNA. Hybrid beings, we're creating human-animal chimeras. Forbidden knowledge, we're pursuing technologies without ethical frameworks. Boundary violation, we're crossing species barriers, merging with machines, claiming to transcend human limitations. Arrogance before God, we're calling it progress and moral duty. Every box checked, every warning sign flashing. And here's the terrifying part. The people driving this don't think they're doing anything wrong, just like the pre-flood generation didn't. They thought they were advancing, improving, evolving. Right up until the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven opened. The judgment came suddenly. Genesis 7:11-12. On that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. That day, one specific day, after centuries of increasing corruption, judgment arrived in 24 hours. And Jesus says his return will be similar. For as in the days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Matthew 24:38-39. Business as usual, normal life, no recognition of impending judgment until it arrives. We're there, eating, drinking, marrying, gene editing, building AI, merging with machines, celebrating our technological prowess. not knowing, not recognizing the pattern. But the dark maps show it clearly. The 7 cities marked the boundaries of pre-flood corruption, geographically and conceptually, and we're rebuilding all 7. Eridu, where divine knowledge descended. Today, universities and labs pursuing forbidden knowledge in genetics and AI. Shuruppak, where flood testimony was preserved. Today, the warnings are available, biblical, archaeological, scientific, but ignored. Larsa and Bad-Tibira, cities built for giants. Today, transhumanist visions of enhanced post-humans requiring new infrastructure. Sippar, the knowledge vault. Today, digital archives containing all human knowledge, plus AI learning systems that could survive human extinction. Larak, city of dark healing. Today, genetic medicine crossing into enhancement, pharmacological consciousness alteration, medical technology without ethical limits. Unnamed city, valley of ultimate corruption. Today, the places where the worst violations occur, the research that even transhumanists whisper about, the things being done in labs nobody talks about publicly. 7 centers of corruption, 7 warnings from history. All being rebuilt simultaneously, not in Mesopotamia this time, globally, Silicon Valley, Beijing, Tel Aviv, Boston, London, wherever the technology is advancing fastest. The geography changed, the principles didn't. And the judgment, coming. Peter describes it in 2 Peter 3:10. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Not water this time, fire, complete dissolution of the current order, reset at cosmic scale. But not yet, there's time, there's warning. That's why the dark maps exist. That's why the ruins remain. That's why we can still read the pattern. God doesn't judge without warning. He warned Noah for 120 years while the ark was being built. He warned through prophets before every major judgment in Scripture. He's warning now through the preserved testimony of Genesis 6:9, the archaeological evidence of the 7 cities, the texts they tried to suppress, the genetic and technological parallels we can recognize, and voices, however marginalized, saying this is the pattern, we're repeating it. The question is whether we'll listen, whether we'll recognize that CRISPR and transhumanism aren't just science advancing, they're humanity reaching again for forbidden knowledge, crossing boundaries we shouldn't cross, creating beings that shouldn't exist. Whether we'll see that the dark maps aren't just ancient history, they're prophecy, blueprint, and warning. The 7 cities fell. The pattern was judged once. It will be judged again. And this time, you know the warning signs. You've seen the maps. You understand what happened before and what's happening now. Which means you have a choice to make. And that choice, what you do with this knowledge, whether you recognize the pattern and warn others, whether you resist the corruption or embrace it as progress, that's what we need to discuss. The unburied truth, what this means for you personally, what your response should be. The final city isn't in Iraq, it's in your heart. And the question is whether you'll let the watchers rebuild there, or whether you'll stand with Noah, genetically pure, spiritually faithful, warning a generation that doesn't want to hear. We're 90 minutes in. You've traveled through 7 buried cities. You've seen evidence institutions don't want discussed. You've traced the pattern from pre-flood corruption to modern technology. And if you're still here, still reading, something inside you is recognizing the truth. Not because I convinced you with rhetoric, because the pattern is undeniable once you see it. And now comes the hard part. What do you do with this? Because knowing the truth creates responsibility. You can't unknow it, can't unsee the parallels, Can't pretend CRISPR gene editing and AI development are just neutral scientific progress now that you understand what happened the last time humanity pursued forbidden knowledge. You've got 3 options. Let me lay them out honestly. Close this video. Dismiss everything as conspiracy theory or fundamentalist fear-mongering. Go back to your comfortable narrative where Genesis 6 is mythology, archaeology and scripture never align, and technological progress is linear advancement with no spiritual dimension. I'm not being sarcastic. That's a legitimate choice. Maybe you need more evidence. Maybe the cognitive dissonance is too uncomfortable. Maybe your worldview can't accommodate angelic rebellion, genetic corruption, and divine judgment as historical realities. If that's where you are, I respect it, but I'd ask you to sit with one question before you dismiss everything. Why does this pattern exist across multiple ancient cultures? Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, Hebrew, even Mesoamerican, describing the same events with the same details if it's purely mythological. Independent invention of identical myths about giants, floods, and divine judgment happening at the same time frame. That's statistically improbable. Collective memory of an actual event. That makes more sense. But if you need to walk away, I understand. This is paradigm-shattering stuff. Not everyone is ready. Dive deeper, start your own research. Verify what I've told you. Challenge my interpretations. Demand primary sources. Good, do that. I want you to. Read the Book of Enoch yourself. It's freely available online, multiple translations. Read the Book of Giants fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Study the Sumerian king list. Look at excavation reports from Mesopotamian sites. Check the flood geology data. Follow Dr. Michael Heiser's work on the Divine Council worldview and ancient Semitic cosmology. Read Dr. Douglas Van Dorn's Giants, Sons of the Gods. Study Dr. Chuck Missler's analysis of Genesis 6. Explore Dr. Timothy Alberino's field research on megalithic structures. I'm not asking you to accept my conclusions uncritically. I'm asking you to investigate honestly. Apply the same scholarly rigor to biblical texts that you'd apply to any ancient Near Eastern document. Don't start with the assumption that supernatural explanations are invalid. Start with the evidence and see where it leads. If you do that, you'll reach the same conclusions I have. Maybe not identical interpretations, but the core truth. Genesis 6 describes historical events. The Nephilim existed. The flood was real, and we're repeating the pattern. And if you want to go academic with this, publish papers, present at conferences, challenge the paradigm professionally, be prepared. You've seen what happened to researchers who did. Careers derailed, funding denied, publications rejected. But maybe you're the one who breaks through. Maybe your scholarship is rigorous enough, your credentials impressive enough, your presentation careful enough that the academic establishment can't dismiss you. We need people like that, warriors in the intellectual trenches, fighting for truth in hostile territory. If that's your calling, I salute you. It's going to cost you, but truth is worth the cost. Recognize the pattern, accept the warning, and live accordingly. This is where I am. This is where I think most of you who have stayed this long will end up. Not necessarily becoming archaeologists or biblical scholars, but understanding the times, recognizing what's happening, refusing to participate in the corruption, and warning others while there's still time. So what does that look like practically? Get grounded in what Scripture actually teaches about spiritual warfare, angelic rebellion, and the reality of ongoing cosmic conflict. This isn't fairy tale stuff. Ephesians 6:12 is explicit. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, spiritual hosts of wickedness. These aren't metaphors for internal psychological struggles. They're intelligent, strategic, supernatural entities who hate humanity because we're made in God's image and they're not. The Watchers rebelled once. They corrupted the human gene pool. They taught forbidden knowledge. God imprisoned them, but their offspring, the Nephilim, died physically, leaving disembodied spirits roaming the earth as demons. And Revelation 12:9 tells us Satan was cast down to earth, along with a third of the angels. Those fallen angels are here, active, working toward the same goal: corrupt humanity, prevent redemption, drag as many souls as possible into rebellion against God. They're not doing this with pitchforks and obvious evil. They're doing it with progress, with enlightenment, with promises of enhancement, transcendence, and evolution. Same tactics, new branding. And if you don't understand the spiritual dimension of what's happening, you'll mistake demonic strategy for human innovation. You'll celebrate technologies that are actually tools of corruption. You'll participate in systems designed to violate God's boundaries. So get theologically grounded. Read Scripture with the understanding that the supernatural is real, active, and strategic. Know where the lines are and refuse to cross them. Genetic editing for therapeutic purposes, repairing defective genes that cause disease. That's medicine. That's operating within the boundaries of stewardship over our bodies. Genetic editing for enhancement, creating superior humans with traits beyond normal variation. That's crossing into forbidden territory. That's the Nephilim project too. Using AI as a tool, pattern recognition, data analysis, automation. That's technology serving human purposes. Creating AGI with consciousness, self-awareness, and autonomous agency. That's attempting to create beings outside God's design. That's the image of the beast project. The line isn't always bright and obvious. There are gray areas, but the principle is clear. Technology that operates within God's created order, respecting boundaries and serving human flourishing under divine design. That's stewardship. Technology that attempts to transcend human limitations, create new categories of being, or merge humanity with non-human entities. That's rebellion. And you, personally, need to know where those boundaries are and refuse to cross them, even if it costs you career opportunities, even if everyone else is doing it, even if refusing makes you look backwards and superstitious. Noah was mocked for 120 years, right up until it started raining. Better to be mocked and right than celebrated and damned. This is the hardest part, because people don't want to hear it. You tell them about the Nephilim, and they think you're into ancient aliens. You mention Genesis 6 being literal, and they assume you're a flat earth fundamentalist. You warn about genetic corruption and transhumanism, and they call you a Luddite who fears progress. And maybe some will, maybe most will. But some won't. Some are ready. Some have been feeling the cognitive dissonance, sensing something is wrong with the cultural trajectory, intuiting that we're heading toward catastrophe but not knowing how to articulate it. For them, this information is a revelation, a framework that makes sense of their unease, an explanation for why progress feels increasingly like corruption. Those are your audience. You're not trying to convince hardened skeptics or wake up people who want to sleep. You're looking for the remnant, the ones who, like you, recognize the pattern when they see it. And when you find them, share what you know, point them to the texts, show them the archaeology, help them see that scripture and evidence align, that the institutions have been suppressing truth, that the warnings are real. You're not building a movement. You're gathering the faithful, preparing the remnant. ensuring that when judgment comes, and it will come, there are people who weren't caught off guard, who understood the times, who warned others and stayed faithful. Remember why Noah was chosen. He was perfect in his generations, Genesis 6:9, genetically unblemished, yes, but also righteous, blameless in his conduct, walking with God while everyone around him pursued corruption. That's the model. You can't control what civilization does. You can't stop transhumanist research. You can't prevent AI development. You can't force institutions to acknowledge suppressed evidence. But you can control you. Your genetics are already determined. You're fully human, created in God's image, part of the redeemed lineage through Christ. Your choices are within your control. Your spiritual state is your responsibility. Your walk with God is what matters. So walk with Him. Stay pure while the world pursues corruption. Remain faithful while others compromise. Hold to truth while institutions suppress it. Be Noah, building the ark, warning whoever will listen, trusting God's judgment and salvation. Here's the final truth that makes all of this bearable. We know how it ends. The Nephilim are judged. The Watchers stay imprisoned. Satan and his angels are thrown into the lake of fire. Death and Hades are destroyed. God creates new heavens and a new earth where righteousness dwells. Revelation 21:3-4. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. The corruption ends, the judgment comes, the redemption is complete. And those who stayed faithful through the corruption, who recognized the pattern, who refused to participate in the rebellion, who warned others and held fast to truth, they inherit the kingdom, not because they were perfect, but because they trusted the one who is. Not because they single-handedly stopped the corruption, but because they remained uncorrupted themselves. That's the promise, that's the hope, that's what makes the cost worth paying. The final question. So here we are, 7 cities explored, 7 warnings heeded, 1 pattern revealed. And now you know, you've seen the dark maps, you understand what they mean, you recognize where we're heading. The question is, what will you do? Will you dismiss this and go back to sleep? Will you investigate and become a scholar? Or will you recognize the times and live as the faithful remnant? I can't answer that for you. This isn't my burden to carry alone, it's yours too now. But I'll tell you what I'm doing. I'm standing with Noah. I'm recognizing the pattern. I'm refusing to participate in the corruption. I'm warning whoever will listen, and I'm trusting that God's judgment is righteous and his salvation is complete. The cities were buried for a reason, but they're not staying buried. God preserved the evidence, left the warnings intact, made sure we could read the pattern. Now we know, the 7 forbidden cities, the dark maps from lost scrolls, the truth they tried to erase. It happened before. It's happening again. And those who understand the times have responsibility to warn, to resist, and to remain faithful. The Nephilim will return, the corruption will intensify, the judgment will come. But so will the King. And when he arrives, those who recognize the pattern, who stayed pure in an impure generation, who held truth in an age of deception, who walked with God while the world pursued forbidden knowledge, will hear the words Noah heard. Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me. Genesis 7:1. That's the promise, that's the hope. The cities are buried, but the truth is unburied now. And what you do with it determines which side of the door you're on when the judgment falls. Choose wisely. If this resonated, if you see the pattern, if you're ready to dig deeper, leave a comment. I read every single one. This community is built on truth seekers who refuse comfortable lies. The seals are broken, the maps are revealed, the warning is given. What happens next is up to you.